over to your chair. Thank you. And we're recording, and I'll turn it over to your chair, Secretary Suzanne Young.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us for today's Climate Council meeting. It's September 4, 2021, and it's a regular meeting of the Council. I'll run through the agenda in a minute, but I would love to introduce Bram Klepner, who is our new council member, recently appointed. Bram, do you want to just say hello and let folks know that you're in the meeting and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. I am here appointed to the seat for Vermont manufacturers in my capacity as CEO of Danforth Pewter, with a manufacturing facility in Middlebury. And I come to climate change work both professionally and personally. Danforth committed some years ago to getting to zero fossil fuel use, and built a solar farm and putting in heat pumps and replacing fossil fuel infrastructure. We did that for a few reasons. One is that many of us believe that global warming threatens to destroy or damage everything we care about. And another is that, our employees care and our customers care. So there are lots of reasons for us professionally to have undertaken the path to get to zero fossil fuel use and to contribute in sort of any way we can. Personally, I got my historic 120-year-old home in Burlington to zero fossil fuel and zero emissions recently, and Burlington Electric believes we were the first historic home to do 100% conversion, and did a fun little video of that project as well. So I'm very happy to be here, and looking forward to helping in any way I can.
Well, thank you, and congratulations on your appointment, and congratulations on your success with your home. That's great news. Well, you're here in the nick of time as we start to gear up to actually pull together the climate action plan. Today's agenda will be review and approval of the August 23 minutes, and then we'll get an update from the just transition principles from the discussion we had at the last meeting. There'll be a discussion around guidance for the subcommittee members from Jane. And then we'll discuss the process for drafting and reviewing the climate action plan from Jane, including some proposed drafting deadlines and drafting assignments. Take a break at 3:10 and come back and talk about the science and data subcommittee recommendations. And then finally, some updates on our public engagement schedule, of course, followed by public comment. So that is the draft agenda. And again, I will have David open it up to whether there's any discussion around the agenda itself or desire to change it up. Thank you.
Super. Thanks, Secretary Young. So before we dive in, any concerns about the agenda and the items we'll be dealing with today? Anything that's not looking right on that agenda that we need to address before we get going? Okay, great. I'm not seeing anything, so let's do it. We have our usual need to approve our minutes from the previous meeting. They are linked into the agenda. I'll give you a second to click on that link if you haven't seen them already. I've been putting in the chat, and Jane as well, the sort of master link to all the documents we'll be using today. And so take a look at that. There's a lot of documents we'll be looking at today. And we should have the minutes links in the agenda. Yep, they're there. So I'll throw those in the chat just one more time in case anybody needs one last look at this. Okay. Are there any concerns about the agenda, or anyone needing one more moment to look over, excuse me, the minutes? Anyone needing one more minute to look over those minutes? Okay, I'm not seeing any concerns or hearing any requests for more time. So let's treat those minutes as approved by you all. Thank you so much. Okay. Before we go to the next piece and really get into the content of our meeting, I think there's something I want to do around acknowledging last week. For those of you that participated in last week's steering committee meeting or observed it, you'll notice, or you felt probably the way I felt, some real palpable tensions. And those were tough, right? Those are tough to have. And as we get going today, I know that Secretary Moore had wanted to say a few words about those palpable tensions to help set the stage for what we hope is, an acknowledgement and some clarity about what we're trying to do today. So I'll just turn it over to you, Secretary Moore, for a second, because I know there's some things that you wanted to say about that before we get into the content of our meeting.
Yes, thank you, David. I appreciate the moment. I think as everyone probably feels, the work of drafting the action plan is pick up steam. And there was a tension last week at the steering committee meeting that seemed like, or at least I'm concerned, could be on its way to becoming a true roadblock to our work. I think we were probably all feeling somewhat recess poor and a bit threadbare at this point in the process, and the pandemic, frankly, too, for that matter. I know I am personally. And just am hopeful that everyone can take a moment to reflect on and recognize the difference between being stretched thin and bad intent. I believe wholly that all counselors need ample opportunity to have their perspectives and priorities considered in developing the plan. And I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and with the belief that everyone will leave with the sense that this is an all hands on deck moment right now. And that we're collectively committed to an approach that allows all counselors as deep into the weeds as each one of us has want and capacity to do, as we all have to lean in and put our shoulder to the work necessary to have a plan ready to be adopted on December 1st. And thank you for a moment before we got started today. I appreciate it.
You bet. Well, thank you. Okay. So that's a sentiment that, hopefully we can carry forward and talk more about as we get into the substance of these conversations, particularly the substance when we talk about the drafting of the plan and that whole process that Jane's going to lay out a proposal for. Okay. All right. So with that, why don't we get into the content of what we need to do today? We've got a bunch of stuff on our agenda. I'm really looking forward to how this goes today. Let's start out with the just transitions piece. For those of you who were there last time, and for those of you who weren't, last time when we spoke about the revised just transition principles based on your feedback, folks were excited about them, and there was one caveat that was put on the table, a caveat that expressed concern that the way that the scoring rubric was phrased and set up suggested there could be actions that had no negative impacts, and that would be a bad thing to be suggesting for a variety of reasons. The Just Transitions subcommittee met, deliberated on that, and there's a note attached to the agenda, a memo from the Just Transitions group. I'm going to turn it over to folks from Just Transitions. I'm looking on the screen who is here right now. Sue's here. I know I can see Iris is here. So why don't I start with Sue and then Sue and Iris or whoever else is here from Just Transitions. Let me turn it over to you to sort of explain the process of this memo and what's in there. Sue?
Yeah, hi, can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, you're okay.
Okay. Thanks so much for setting the context, and just for everybody to consider, a little bit longer, something that we've worked very hard all together to understand and think through. And I guess that the hope of bringing it up again was just to spend a little more time with the nuance of the principles and the rubric for, quote, scoring. That I think there's a sort of basic misunderstanding that the rubric is scoring or could be conceived as scoring the impact of a proposal. But in fact, what it's trying to do is help us really score the application of the guiding principles to the development of the proposed idea. So rather than saying, oh my gosh, this is going to have a negative impact on people, or to say, we are only going to accept proposals that have zero negative impact. That's not the purpose. It's actually saying, how are we thinking about those potential impacts? And so we wrote a lovely piece, and I would acknowledge Iris as the author of the piece. So Iris, I certainly want you to speak up to kind of try to clarify that, because I think our conversation last time may have evolved around a less than full assessment of how the rubric is to be utilized. So we just wanted to throw that out there because we agreed to talk about it again. And I think the group really felt strongly that we didn't feel like it was appropriate to have negative. We still don't think so. Of course, if that is still the way that members of this body want to validate their concerns, that's fine. But we wanted to see if there would be a reconsideration and after maybe reading them a little more carefully. Again, we're not asking to score impact of a proposal. We're asking to score the application of the principles in the development of the proposal. So I don't know, Iris, if that is what you tried to articulate. And if you look at the piece that was put together by Iris and others, you'll see the language in the rubric actually talks about looking at the potential impacts, and that the scoring actually focuses on identifying whether those impacts were considered. So I don't know, Iris, anything you want to add or clarify? Hopefully I didn't muddy the waters.
No, that sounds really good. I think mostly it's just that our conversation at the last meeting got side-railed onto something that was just not based on what our rubric was. And I'm hoping that this sort of clarified that. And I would love to hear maybe if people have those same concerns, because if they do, I think that's important. But we really did try to address where we should be shifting the burdens and benefits of these policies, and to what communities we should be doing that to. So I would, if those are still concerns that are in people's minds, I want to hear it. If that would resolve things, that's good also.
Great. All right, thanks to you both. Rich, go ahead. And our goal here we want to do this in about 5 minutes, is to say, okay, does this clarify our concerns? Are we okay to embrace this as the council's sort of pathway for just transitions and principles? Rich, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I speak as one who was a little concerned about the text without the explanation that we just heard. And Sue and Iris, I quite like your explanation just now. And I don't know if this is a sufficiently apt analogy, but it reminds me of an environmental impact statement, where the principles developed under NEPA and similar state laws for environmental assessment, never demanded that projects have zero impacts. They just required that the consideration of the project consider what those impacts would be and weighed them carefully in decision making. And what I just heard from Sue and Iris sounds similar to that for equity considerations, and which to me sounds like a really positive thing.
Thanks, Rich. Does anybody have lingering concerns about this, or isn't ready yet to say, let's go forward and give the full bear hug to these just transition principles? Anything else that's lingering out there?
Dave, I think I'd like to speak to the issue.
Yeah, you bet.
I think I recall being one of the principal drivers of the concern last time around. I did look at the scoring sheet after our meeting, and I found my concerns justified. What I'm hearing here today is that the group has gone back, has examined the issue, believes at least partly that the conversation last week went sideways, or last time around went sideways, and continues to believe that the rubric is appropriate in its treatment of proposals that would have negative impacts. I've heard two different things. I've heard the proposition that the group understands that it's not, that they're not only considering accepting proposals that have no negative impacts. And I hear that qualified by, though they still think it's not appropriate to have negative impacts. And so as I listen to those two statements, given the nature of how we're making decisions, I'm inclined to defer to the proposition that the committee understands that it has drawn up a rubric that does not aim to only accept proposals with no negative impacts. And I think that's what I'm going to see as the takeaway here. And I think I've been sufficiently clear that there is no such thing, at least in my space, as a project in the energy world that does not have negative impacts. And so if that is in fact where the committee is as well, then I will accept the representation that the rubric functions the way that the Just Transitions Committee says it does.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, June. Secretary Moore?
Thank you. I just was hoping maybe Jane could add a little clarity here. I know that we are in the process of securing a contractor to help support the application of the rubric. And I've heard sort of a couple of different understandings of what the contractor services will actually entail, and would love for Jane to just be able to give a quick overview of that so folks know what tools are available to them as well in thinking this through to its logical end.
Thank you, Secretary Moore. Good afternoon, everyone. So I wish the contract was signed on the dotted line so I could speak with you all about the consultant themselves, but we're still working through the contractual process and really hopeful to have that persons, I should say, on board within the next day or two. We already have a meeting set up with them to start to clarify the support that they'll provide subcommittees and councils with respect to the back work needed for them to come into your meetings to support them. But our understanding and expectation is that through some homework that subcommittees and or the council ultimately will do around elevating a number of your actions to consider and review with the scoring rubric, that the consultant will provide the capacity in that meeting in real time to work you through a number of examples. I wish I could tell you exactly how many, but a substantive number of your actions through a collective process with the subcommittee and then ultimately with the council, so that you will all feel confident in then using the scoring rubric to review the remaining action items. And hopefully you will have done the work necessary to elevate the ones that are most in need of collective decision-making around the application of the scoring rubric. And then the consultant will be able to provide you in detail meeting summaries of the decisions and conversation that we'll have, again, furthering your understanding and application of use of the guiding principles and the scoring rubric. So hopeful that person will be on board soon, hopeful that you will be able to make it through a large portion of your actions with them, with their support, but then ultimately expect that there'll be some work independent as well for the subcommittees, recognizing the timeline.
Super. Okay. Thanks, Jane. Okay. So let me just test something here. It sounds like with the clear understanding that the way these just transitions principles and scoring rubric are framed, it accepts the fact that negative impacts are associated with a lot of recommendations. And just as Sue articulated in Iris, and with the analogy provided by Rich, we're taking that on board and we're saying, yep, we like these just transitions principles and rubric, we're going to use them as a council. And I just want to test if anybody can't live with that at this point, or if everybody's on board. So any further concerns or reasons why people couldn't embrace these just transition principles and rubric now? Anything else? Catherine? Yeah.
Are you going to ask a question about the process for using the rubric separate from that question you just asked, or are you considering
Yeah.
it the all in
Yeah,
one?
let me ask that separately. Let me just check on the actual document of the just transition principles and matrix of questions. Any concerns before we say, yep, we as a council, we're embracing these? Anything else to say? Okay. So with that, we say you all as a council are taking on these just transitions principles and squaring rubric as your own for the subcommittees to use in their process and for you as a council to use. And that's great. Now, the process that Jane just laid out, Catherine, do you have a question about that?
Just a general comment that it sounds like we're getting less help with this than I thought we were about a month ago when this was first talked about, bringing some consultant assistance in. And I just want to express concern about our capacity as a subcommittee, both in time and in knowledge, to give this analysis the respect that it deserves in the process.
Jane, can you say a little bit about how, if this has evolved or not evolved? Has there been a change in effort here?
No, not maybe in my clarity around communicating it, but this has always been the vision, largely in line with the three-pronged approach around equity. I recognize the timeline, but we have talked a lot about the application and consistency of having you all empowered to understand the recommendations that you're putting forward. And ultimately, as you think about and are the people in the position to answer questions from the public, the legislature, others around their implementation, our hope and appreciation with Just Transitions has been that you all should be in the best position to use these documents, and that the consultant will be here to support it as in an interim period, but that was always going to be temporal and never comprehensive of all the actions.
Well, I'll apologize if I misunderstood that, because when you mentioned this at the subcommittee meeting last week, as you know, I was surprised at the level of assistance that we were getting, because it's less than what I had anticipated. And so if I misunderstood that and therefore I'm seeing it as a change, I'm sorry. That being said, it is where we are. And my concern remains the same, that we don't have the time nor the expertise to give this the respect that it deserves in the process. And I just want to put that concern out there, because I don't want to shortchange this. And it's important that we don't. And so I just want to throw that concern out there.
Thanks, Catherine. I think it's a big challenge for all of us figuring that out. What is possible and appropriate from now until December 1st, and then how Just Transitions becomes part of an ongoing piece of work after this initial plan is released on December 1. So it's noted. I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything else about this concern Catherine's raising before we finish up on this topic and move to the next piece. Is there anything else folks want to share about that? Abby?
I guess I don't have anything specific to share, but just want to echo some of Catherine's concerns, just so that it's very clear on the public record that there is, that we are on a rapidly impending deadline, and, this work is of the utmost importance, and I want it to be known that the intention of the council and the subcommittees is to do justice to this work in an equitable fashion. And so, I just want the record to show that we all know that, we need to continue moving, and we're going to move forward with the best intentions that we can, with the most apt knowledge that we possess. But there are certainly capacity issues, and I, want to back Catherine up in flagging that.
Thanks, Abby. That's great. Chris?
Thanks. And I'll just add, I've mentioned this before, but I'll just say it again, that, include applying the principles to public engagement and to the development of the plan is important, but what's really going to also be critical is applying the principles to future legislation, to rulemaking, and various, especially to budgeting. Budgeting is that's the ultimate statement of policy priorities, and so we're going to have to bird dog this, for the entire process, and not only in this iteration of the plan, but all those coming. So I absolutely I hear and appreciate Catherine's concerns, but we're going to have to keep an eye on this and hold ourselves to the principles for the entire process going forward. So just a reminder of that.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. And you all as a council now have this document, this orientation, these principles, right? So you have something to offer in these next steps forward. Okay. All right. So with that, let's move on to our next substantive piece that we want to do today. And those concerns are really noted and will be reflected in the minutes too. So everybody has that clear. Our next piece we call in the agenda, it's called guidance for subcommittees, right? Plan to support consistent analysis and prioritization, right? So what this is, and hopefully folks have had a chance to look at the proposal that's been linked to the agenda since late last week. This is an effort to really think through what some people call prioritization, other people call just getting organized and getting clarity of our process in subcommittees. Our goal today with this is to say we as a council think this is the right guidance for subcommittees, and or we like it in principle, but we want to see these changes to it, and we'll record those very clearly. We do want to end this session today with some clear messaging for our subcommittees so that everybody's clear like how to do this work, because it's happening right now. So our goal is to really get as clear guidance as possible for the subcommittees using this proposal as a basis. With that, I'll turn it over to Jane to walk us through what this proposal says. Again, the materials are online in that link provided in the chat.
Okay, afternoon again, everybody. Hopefully. I think that the conversation that we just started to have around timing and capacity was a good framing for the intent around our process today and the conversation. I do want to note that the PowerPoint was updated as of this morning, so I did make and try to reflect some changes that I heard as this was rushed through with the steering committee last week due to other conversations at that meeting and didn't have enough time to really dive into. So we offered the steering committee members as well as others to comment in written form on the ideas being put forward in this process. I've done my best to reflect changes where they were easy to come to consensus and make, and also offer some alternative approaches in this presentation today to hopefully stimulate some thinking around how we could do this differently, and albeit recognizing the time pressures and how to do it comprehensively. So I'll start by recognizing that our intent of this prioritization is intended to inform and be based upon the foundational criteria that we've tried to pull from the Global Warming Solutions Act to the best of our ability based on the language in the GWSA. These are the ideas that we've been floating with you through our presentations and communications of the materials to date, really trying to speak to how we elevate the ideas and recommendations coming out of the subcommittees and ultimately decided upon by all of you through the adoption of the Climate Action Plan based on the principles that we see as important as well as relative to the GWSA requirements. So those criteria, which we'll speak to how we see using them as well as defining them today, include co-benefit, cost effectiveness, what we're calling impact or progress towards the GWSA requirements and or goals being proposed by ag and ecosystems and rural resilience and adaptation, justice and equity around the application of the guiding principles and scoring rubric, as well as feasibility. And we'll talk, I have it framed here on this slide as technical feasibility, but there's an alternative approach to how we might think about what feasibility means here too that we'll also discuss. All of this comes together for us to put forward and prioritize our ideas within the space of the three-legged stool that needs good climate policy: sequestration, resilience and adaptation, as well as our mitigation strategies. Just a reminder of what we've done to date. Back in July, the council got sort of what we're calling a sneak peek of all of the pathways and a representative set of strategies that came from the subcommittees that are working on them: ag and ecosystems, rural resilience and mitigation, cross-sector mitigation largely. Those have been refined and taken further based on public input, and I should say will be taken a bit further with respect to stakeholder engagement and public engagement this fall. All of those pathways and strategies will be included in the way we have the CAP outline designed. Those will not be prioritized. There will be a process to consolidate and think across recommendations, but all of them will be highlighted. So there's no need to think about how we prioritize based on the process we're putting forward. We have been communicating with the subcommittees that less is more, recognizing also that it's not less for the sake of less, that we have statutory obligations to meet, but that there's a challenge of keeping people's attention and interest in this and really being able to communicate what we see as necessary actions over the course of the life of this climate action plan. There's also conversation about really how ruthless we want to be about less is more, and I'm open to hearing pushback on that from all of you. I also just want to propose that there has been discussion over the best language here. We proposed pathways, strategies, and actions. I would argue that we never formally adopted that language, however, have been running with it. And that really stemmed from the mitigation space. Pathways is a language that was used and put forward by Energy Action Network, moved into the cross-sector space. And so as Marian and I worked on definitions for pathways, strategies, and actions and thought about a framework for the CAP outline, that was what was in front of us, and we utilized that. Pathways are almost synonymous with the word goals, and there is a recognition that goals, if we're trying to be more accessible with our language and plain speak, we could just start to take out pathways, substitute in goals, and that might have more of an impact with folks' receptivity to the plan. So I leave that there as a question. Also, I also recognize in some spaces of this work that pathways is the language that is often utilized. So what this council has not seen and what we will start to bring up to the council from the subcommittees are the actions, the operational tasks that are needed to implement the pathways, goals, and strategies. Those actions are what has really been the heart of what the subcommittees have been working on over the course of the last few weeks. And our schedule, as we'll look forward to the rest of this month, we'll have ag and ecosystems, rural resilience, and cross-sector presenting substantively on their actions for consideration with all of you. Those are the nexus of where we see or are recommending where prioritization should occur. So we want to distinguish those actions between those that are ready for immediate implementation versus those that require further development. And we really want to focus and have more detail around what we prioritize and assess at the level of ready to implement. On the next slide, I'll sort of dive into a little bit more further thinking about what ready for implement looks like and how we might further break it down. But I really just want to draw your attention to that, again, that in the plan, we're thinking about all pathways, all strategies being illustrated, and then having this distinction around actions ready for implementation and needing further development. Recognizing that this is still a tremendous amount of work to put forward in the CAP outline in the CAP. Some subcommittees have 40, 50 strategies. So taken together, this will be a lot to synthesize and digest for any one reader. So the process that we're suggesting for incorporating the foundational criteria into both the analysis and prioritization is really envisioned with a recognition on the extremely tight timeframe that we've been given and the period that we're moving into towards December 1st right now. Recognizing that in a perfect world, I think that this would be more comprehensive. And so recognizing as we talk through this today, I'll be more illustrative around ways that we could improve around it based on if we had more time, but leave that to you all to consider how much specificity we want to build into this process. So first and foremost, and this is really what's happening right now at the subcommittee level, a consolidation of pathways, strategies, and actions. So much of this work was done by task leads in their respective areas, and that's all being assimilated now into sort of cumulative products in the mitigation, resilience and adaptation, and sequestration bodies of work. Those experts on those subcommittees that we worked hard to have that technical experience needed to do this work, as well as diversity of opinions and folks around the table are trying to consolidate down and recognize where strategies are very similar, try to pull up and pull in to consolidate that work and make it more clear and not as duplicative with repeating strategies and pathways. We are suggesting that for each strategy, which is where the actions come in, that subcommittees take a crack at sorting those actions that are ready for immediate implementation versus the ones that need further development. What we mean by that is ready, meaning it has a realistic path to implement in the near term. That could be programmatic, it could be authority to do it, or funding that helps us achieve that action idea. And implement means that there is a clear body, agency, nonprofit, legislature, someone who will act upon the action now. I do want to recognize that a further analysis of these actions could be broken down by an implementation timeline, which I do think is really important, but struggle with how we get there across all of the actions, but put that out there. I do think that we have been thinking around ready to implement is this time period of this climate action plan. So in the next 2 years or so, recognizing that if we start to act on any of these actions, they could take as long as the 4-year window for this climate action plan to move on. But we also thought and have heard suggested at subcommittees that it would be much clearer for the public if, as we prioritize those actions that are ready, that we also broke them down into buckets that are actions that need legislative change, rulemaking, and or actions that any everyday Vermonters could take up and act on. So those are other considerations as we think about how we break down actions. But for now, the basic premise that we're proposing for you to consider is that sorting a first sort at the subcommittee level of ready for immediate implementation versus further development needed. Once you've gotten to that place, once the subcommittees have been able to bucket their work that way, we are implying that you would then focus the analysis for the 5 foundational criteria on the actions that are ready for implementation. We're hoping that by doing this, we would create a transparent process to evaluate actions against the criteria. We hope that the expert judgment, by creating clear definitions for the 5 criteria that we'll look at shortly, will provide an easy to use bucketing of the work so that you can sort by the 5 criteria largely by high, medium, and low, or yes or no answers to keep things moving through a process, but in a public meeting having had that discussion and consideration around the actions. We also think that this being the prioritization tool would ultimately allow you to further refine your actions that are actually ready versus the ones that you thought were ready, but perhaps need further development over time. And I think that one of the confusing components of this process that we're suggesting, in order to keep it kind of neat and sweet in the climate action plan, that rather than showing that assessment in the body of the climate action plan for every action, even though that would be done by the action level, that there would be some consolidation of a narrative of how you speak to that prioritization of a bucket of actions at the strategy level, so that you could be synthesizing and communicating the prioritization that was done by each strategy. Recognizing that transparent spreadsheet analysis would be in an appendix safe for somebody to actually look at and review. So the process, as highlighted on this slide on the left, is what I just talked through. And really, before we move into looking at the definitions, which we could do first, I'd like to pause and suggest the questions that we've put forward here and ask you all, one, are we headed in the right direction for the product for December 1st, recognizing the time frame that we have to do this work and the mandate that we have? So really focusing on highlighting all of the pathways and strategies, but then focusing our prioritization around the action level on the ones that are ready for implementation. Is this enough clarity? Is it enough specificity? What can we do to set ourselves up to do this work in more detail after December 1st? These are the kinds of questions that I'm still struggling with and would love to hear folks' opinions on. And then the next question is really around our process for subcommittees. Is it clear and appropriate? And recognizing that the analysis at the action level will be presented by strategy on a consolidated group of actions, really focusing in on expert judgment by using that mainly high, medium, and low framework to analyze each action. And also assuming that we won't be weighting any of the criteria, that we're really just speaking to all 5 of them in a consistent way, but not giving more weight to any of the 5 components that we're proposing. So I'll pause there. I know it's a lot, and I've also put questions in the back of your mind too, and look forward to hearing feedback as well as moving towards definitions for the criteria.
Great. Super. Thanks, Jane, so much. And again, there's one more slide that has definitions. We'll get there in a second. But before we get to the definitions, questions, comments, reactions. Jared, and then Rich.
Thanks, David. And thank you, Jane. I think this has clearly been the result of a lot of hard work and really thoughtful, combining of different conversations across the different subcommittees. I want to respond to a few of the specific questions that you posed, Jane. One is on the question of terminology and pathways versus goals. I would defer to other subcommittees that are more focused on adaptation and resilience in terms of whether or not that works for them. I think that in the mitigation space for the cross-sector subcommittee and focusing on emissions reduction goals would be really problematic. I think part of that is the history related to the language of goals. We have had greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals in statute since 2007 that were blown past. And similarly, we had a goal to weatherize 80,000 homes in Vermont by 2020 that, we didn't even get halfway to. So, I think that pathways, strategies, and actions works well, at least in the mitigation space, because it recognizes that we have legally binding requirements to achieve emissions reduction. Sometimes I think of the term goals as something that would be nice to achieve if you could, but you're not really bound to it, like a New Year's resolution or something. And that's not the space that we're in on this. So I would suggest, at least as it comes to mitigation, that we stick with the work, the framework and language we've been using. I would also, on this topic of less is more, I understand and appreciate that in terms of, just clarity and not overwhelming people. But I think that latter part that you raised, Jane, is really important to underline, that it is so long as what is presented adds up to meeting our requirements per the statute. We don't want to have a shorter list if it doesn't actually do the job. And if a longer list is necessary of pathways, strategies, and actions, then we shouldn't kind of arbitrarily try to cut that off. Lastly, on the kind of organization and prioritization, I appreciate and agree with the desire to put a number of recommendations forward and not be overly concerned about the order. Again, with regard to the mitigation pathways, strategies and actions, I would suggest that for clarity of the reader and the audience that this will be going to, it would be important to organize and prioritize those based on impact so that we can see the larger ones that add up to meeting the emissions reduction requirements. For instance, I think it makes sense to lead that section, as I think is currently drafted for the CAP, with the transportation sector first, the thermal sector second, rather than starting with some of the non-energy sectors first, just for clarity. And that would be, I think I heard you say, Jane, a suggestion around organization of topics by ready to implement versus impact. That may work again for other sections of the report, but at least as some of the things I've been focused on in terms of mitigation pathways, I think it should be impact in terms of meeting the required emissions reduction impacts. Thanks. Those are my few comments to start.
Okay, thanks, Jared. Appreciate that. Rich?
Some of my comments are pretty similar to Jared's. I have a comment to make that this is following on our committee's discussion of what do we mean by ready for implementation. I think we have to be clear that it can't mean that an action could be adopted by rule by a state agency in February. We have to accept that quite a number of the actions that we're going to be recommending will require legislative action. They may be fully formed, they may be ready to be recommended to the legislature in a concrete way. And I see James nodding. I'm just wanting to make sure that people understand that ready for implementation doesn't just mean, oh, well, we can just allocate these funds in the budget this way and we're done. Quite a number of things are going to require legislative consideration, and that's, I hope, understood by all. With respect to not prioritizing among the 5 big criteria, I agree with the presentation that we should be considering all of our major recommendations according to all 5 of the criteria. And globally, one is not more important than the other, across all of our action steps. But it's also important, and I'm echoing Jared, and certainly the cross-sector mitigation committee has in mind, top of mind, is that the actions have to add up to policies that would meet the emission reduction requirements. And therefore, when prioritizing, it's going to be essential to say, well, in order to meet the requirements, these are the action steps that we think are the most important ones. So I don't think we can sidestep that. And I hope everybody understands that at some point that's going to be a discipline. Jane's comment, beginning to be sure we understand is, it's important to underscore that now and be ready for that to be, part of the hard conversations when we get down to our recommendations.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, and I just want to triple emphasize that in all this communication, everyone, Jane, myself, everybody wants to make really clear that there is no questioning that what's put forward has to meet the legal requirements, including the emissions reduction requirements. So I want to make sure everyone gets that message, because we're certainly putting it out there in a lot of different ways. Catherine?
Thanks. In response to your questions, I do think this makes sense. My question is, first trying to think about, having seen the definitions, how they fit to the resilience and adaptation piece, because I think we have to kind of wedge our way into some of the definitions looking ahead. But where is the space for high impact actions that maybe aren't ready to go, but need to be worked on now in order to move them forward? Where do they fall into this prioritization approach?
Thanks, Catherine. I
Well-
wonder, Jane, if you want to take a whack at that, how you think about that.
Sure. But love to hear everybody's thoughts on that. But we, at the beginning of the CAP outlining, we had considered using language enabling actions as well, which would speak to the recognition that, like land use is a great example, and it will have an impact farther down the road, takes a while to get there, but we don't want to start turning the ship, right before 2050 if we know it's a critical component of how we're going to meet our emissions reductions in the long run. So we have thought about that there are going to be ready to implement actions that are critical components of larger bodies of work that will show and make it through as ready to implement now through the process that we've put forward, even if they're components of larger policy or initiatives or other components of work that are building up to something bigger. So in our conversations, we thought that they would still, like, the components to help move and enable those bigger things to happen would show up as ready. And so we thought it would be simpler just to keep it as ready versus further development needed, but also welcome the idea of thinking about another bucket of enabling actions or different language that folks would like to see.
Yeah, I appreciate that approach of breaking those into the steps necessary to get there and what do you need to do right away. I'm trying to square that with the less is more approach as well. And how do you balance that? So it may be that we need a different category for those actions that are super important, high impact, and need multiple steps, but aren't ready to go per se. Just throw that out there.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah. Secretary Moore.
I just wanted to add on to that because Catherine, I think that's a really important piece, particularly for things that are going to require budget in order to get from here to there. And that'll be I think a part of the conversation and aligns with what Jane was laying out too. And that the ready to implement may not actually see us all the way through to the finish line, but is that important next step, quantifiable next step. It may not yield a measurable impact on greenhouse gas emissions or resilience or sequestration. However, I think we do need a place for some of those further study and evaluation required or foundation building, whatever the term of art we want to use is, so that we have a place to not only have those initiatives live, but frankly, recognize the resources that's going to be required to move them from here to there.
Thanks. Lauren, sorry, I think I jumped over you.
Yeah, that's okay. My comments are probably going to sound remarkably similar to Catherine's. I'm glad to hear it seems like a bit of concern over a less is more approach and understanding that, comprehensive climate action is going to require a lot of effort. And so that pervasive narrative seems to be a bit toned down maybe in this version. Thanks, Jane, from the past one that we had seen as a full council. I'm glad to see that's changed because I do think if it takes a lot of action to move the needle on any of the different buckets, then it's going to take a lot of action. With respect to the ready now versus not yet ready approach, I think that's unnecessarily binary. And I also think that if that's the first level of filter before we can even get to recognizing those 5 foundational criteria, as we're calling them, then we're essentially assuming that that is our most important criteria or value in this plan. If we're going to say this suite of actions are not ready yet, but they can still be in the plan, but they're not going to be actually analyzed against the different criteria, then we're saying that's the most important thing to move forward, is that it's actually ready. And I'm concerned that some of those things, to Catherine's point, that will likely be high impact, but will require a handful of steps, foundational efforts to be laid now, sooner rather than later, for the actions, their outputs to be realized. we're going to miss that opportunity if we're not putting it through the same level of analysis. I think that might be as easy as just, instead of saying ready now versus ready later, analyze versus don't analyze against criteria, we could just say implement an implementation scale, like those that are ready now, checks a ready now bucket. Or we say, you know, ready beginning in 2022 versus beginning in 2024. And that might be a better way to address opportunities for high impact, but not necessarily ready now opportunities.
Thanks, Lauren. So there's a bunch of comments around this same thing, and I wonder if we can, you know, circle in on some of these ideas that Lauren's putting out there, or Catherine. One of the issues here, and I welcome folks who are really active in the subcommittees. One of the challenges we see in the time frame we have to not just get to December 1st, but get to the next like 3 weeks where you need to present something to the council, and then another 3 weeks to present something more definitive, is how much can you actually analyze about all the things that are in front of you? And so we were wondering if there's a way to help the subcommittees themselves parse out the things to say, these are really good ideas. We really want people to take them up after December 1st and start thinking about them in more detail. The things that are kind of ready to go, or we can use different language, we're gonna lean into those, analyze those more deeply, so that we understand where we want to put points of emphasis in December 1, which is right around the corner. So I'm wondering for those who have raised those concerns, are there ways that we can help subcommittees get the focus they need and so they can best use the time they have? Jane?
Yeah, I really appreciate Lauren's comments, and have struggled with the bucketing of ready to implement versus further development, largely as we've come to see and learn from the subcommittees their full body of work. I think that's an artificial distinction that's probably actually not going to accomplish much of splitting than maybe we had thought about as we were looking at things that really are like pie in the sky, need further development, which I perhaps thought there would be more of. But as I've seen the body of work, I've recognized that that's a hard distinction to make between the actions that are being proposed by the subcommittees and I actually do appreciate that perhaps what's necessary is a review of all the actions in some way against the criteria, but recognize that the enormity of that task would largely lead us to think about a streamlined version of how we review and critique actions against the criteria in a way that's efficient, and helping us bucket the work in a way that is more communicative to the audience that we're trying to capture with the plan, albeit the implementors of the plan. And so ask that of all of you, and recognize also as you're thinking about the work that's coming out of the subcommittees for the folks who are involved in it, how much does the binary, as Lauren described it, or as we put forward, process of ready to implement plus further development actually get you in creating a prioritization? Or is that not helpful in that the work that you're seeing is all ready to implement largely because it's really just about scale of impact as folks have proposed?
Bram, go ahead, please.
I wonder if instead of ready to implement and not ready to implement, another helpful way of thinking about it is actions which will be able to be completed in time to contribute to getting to the 2025 goal versus those which can be completed in time to get to the 2030 goal, and those which can be completed in time to get to the 2050 goal.
Yep, that's another way. That's a particularly helpful framing for the emissions reduction strategies. It may be a more challenging framing for adaptations, resilience strategies, or sequestration. That could be an interesting way to do it. Are there other ideas? Go ahead, Bram. Yeah. Are there other thoughts on this, Rich?
Well, I find myself agreeing with the comments made by Lauren and Catherine that the apparent binary characterization isn't really the most useful for the work of those committees. And I guess I would urge them using, their review of all of the 5, big criteria to identify the highest priorities, and then to identify the shorter term implementation steps that would get us on the pathway towards those priorities. And I'm guessing that that's in fact how they think about it. I don't think I'm telling them anything new by mentioning that, but that would certainly not surprise me if that was how the committee could prioritize among what could be a really long list of potential actions and strategies.
Thanks, Rich. How does that sound, folks? Particularly those of you who have had some concerns around this ready to implement stage. What Rich puts out is look at all your actions against the criteria. And then once you've done that, let things float up to the top and also identify these shorter term implementation steps. How does that feel as a more appropriate and realistic path? Abby?
I'm trying to ground this in, I'm not sure if we've tackled yet the breakdown of when Ag and Eco and Rural Resilience are supposed to start delivering things to the VCC, but I'm just wanting to understand, is this adding another, are we supposed to have the equity screening done, this prioritization done, and this review done by, and it also says 9/21 on the draft, which Billy and I were both under the impression that we had until 9/24, which would give us another additional working meeting. And so I'm just trying to clarify by what date the different pieces are supposed to be done, because that's quite a body of work to tackle in a very short period of time.
The expectation for the meeting at the end of the month has been just a comprehensive list of the body of work coming out of the subcommittees. And so the hope, I will admit, had been that the equity screening would occur during the month of September, so that first screening had been done and had been in place to help advance the work with the council. But at this point, we're going to get as far as we can, but the nature of those presentations will be a cumulative list of your work. And as we speak to this at the end of the meeting today, our expectation around drafting timeline review by counselors is that we're trying to take action at council meetings, and the timeline that we have been given really sets us up to have the need for counselors to have the information a week ahead of time, so that we can fully expect that people will have time to read through. There'll be no way for subcommittees to present on a comprehensive list of your actions. There'll be too many. So we'll be elevating, similarly to how you did with pathways and strategies, you'll present, I imagine, the majority of your strategies and a subset of actions to illuminate what you envision for how that strategy will move forward. And so the nature of that list that will go out to the council a week ahead of time will allow counselors to review and raise any red flags that they might have with you when you present that you may not have articulated. So I'm not sure if I'm clear yet on timeline around the equity screening. Timeline will unfold this week as the consultant comes on board and delivers a clear message about what they expect to do with the subcommittees and when, and what work is needed to advance that. And based on where we land with prioritization today, we'll be able to start to move that out to subcommittees and create a clear timeline for when we expect it would be done.
Okay, so by sorry, I'm not trying to, I just want to make sure that we all are working from the same end. So by 9/21, Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee and Rural Resilience need to just have the compiled lists to the full council, and then we can begin to tackle equity and prioritization as it unfolds per your directionals in the next few weeks. That doesn't have to be done by 9/21.
No, thanks, Abby.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, the laws of physics still apply, I would say. Okay. All right, so let me just see if I'm clear where we're at with this right now. The things that we've been stressing is, one, on this ready to implement piece, that's not feeling like it's working. It's better to look at all your actions with the criteria and let that create a prioritization. And then from that, also look at shorter term implementation steps that you want to highlight. That's what I heard, and that may be able to address the other concern about these high impact actions that aren't strictly like ready to implement tomorrow. Okay, so that seems like a change we're making to this. I want to make sure I'm articulating that correctly. Another piece that we've talked about is less is more. Sure, for clarity, that's true. However, it needs to add up to the statutory requirements, and comprehensive climate action takes a lot of work. So let's not ignore that fact. We heard also in terms of sort of how you list things, how we eventually list things in the climate action plan, listing things that have greater impact higher than those who don't. As you list pathways, that probably makes some sense. And terminology wise, from a mitigation standpoint, it's really tough to change to goals. That may be useful terminology for other pathways around adaptation resilience. But having two terminologies in the same report may turn out to be difficult. So I don't know, Jane, how you feel about that? So that's what I've heard as like the big ideas coming out of this conversation. Jane, do you want to improve on that or correct something?
Yeah, I have two sort of clarifying questions to the council. I would love if we could resolve and have council agreement on if pathways is best to be consistent across all of the pathways across the three subcommittees, or if the council would prefer to see pathways used for cross-sector only for mitigation, and then goals for the other, the body of work in resilience and sequestration and adaptation. So I would love clarity around that, not to leave it ambiguous. And then second, I would ask, I feel like there's still a little bit of clarity, and if not resolved today, just ask around process around, I feel, I really like removing the ready for implementation versus further development, thinking about a prioritization for all of our actions, and then sorting them by an implementation schedule. I feel a little less clear on what the implementation schedule is defined by. And I'm more than happy to work on that for the steering committee for next week with support from others, but just want to say that that's another ambiguous point for me right now a little bit.
Okay. I wonder if I want to just share my notes for a second to see if we're all on the same page, because I think we really should here take advantage of this opportunity to provide subcommittees clarity on what the process is. I would be interested to hear from Lauren and from Catherine and others who have been concerned about the way prioritization was happening. Does the way that Rich explained it and I tried to reiterate seem like a better pathway, a better way to go about this? Does that address the concern?
I'd admittedly have to rehear what it was that Rich recommended before I can say yes or no.
Okay. I think what I heard, folks can correct, what I'm hearing is, let's forget about that step of ready to implement. Let's just get rid of that step. And instead, what you're going to do after you sort out, you've created this package of pathway, strategy, and actions, run your process of looking at the 5 criteria through everything, all your actions, do it, right? You're going to have a lot, so you're going to have to be efficient probably with that. And through that process, you will see actions rise to the top, right? Through a prioritization process. And that's how you prioritize. And then what you do is you say, among those things, where are there shorter term implementation steps that we need to flag right here? So that there's clarity about what needs to happen right away, whether it's stuff that legislation that gets taken up now, rulemaking, etc. That's what I heard from Rich. Yeah.
That's pretty much what I was trying to say.
Okay, good. Jane, do you want to improve on that?
Right. Nope, that was really helpful. Thank you, David. I think I got it. I just want to answer Bram and then Catherine's comment in the chat and say that right now in the climate action plan as outlined, we have a cumulative assessment of impact for the 2025 requirements for mitigation specifically, because that is analysis that we will have to support the document. So all of the actions being put forward are the pathways and strategies and actions and mitigation, I should say, we will know if they add up to get to the 2025 requirement. And we have a section in the climate action plan that articulates that. Right now, we don't have that essentially for resilience, adaptation, and sequestration. And I'll say that there are, we want to consider how we do that and how we measure progress in that space. And there's a science and data task lead that is working on that. And right now we are thinking about how to build upon that for further analysis for future iterations of the CAP. But I'm not quite sure how we would really sort that are required for the deadlines in those spaces of work. Yeah.
Okay. Jared, and then let's see where we're at, because we really need to round up this conversation.
Yeah, just a clarifying question or maybe a friendly amendment to what Jane said. My understanding is that we will have the analysis not just for 2025, but also 2030, that the plan is being, so, okay, that was just a.
Okay. Okay, so I just want to share something real quick, which is my screen. And these are messy notes of me just taking some notes, but I think let's look at them for 1 second to see if we capture, because coming out of this meeting, I'd love for the subcommittees to have as much clarity as possible of what's going on. These are the pieces that I've captured, right? What we just talked about in getting rid of that ready for implementation step. Ditch that, do your analysis on all your actions, let your prioritization flow from there, and then identify shorter term implementation steps that get us towards the goal or moving towards that. Okay. Next, the less is more is causing some angst because it absolutely has, what we present has to add up to the requirements. And also comprehensive climate action takes a lot of action, right? So let's recognize that. Okay, on terminology, we don't have a result yet. Let me suggest that we don't need to solve that today. Jane might kill me for this, but I feel like that's something is a terminology word that doesn't affect how we are doing the work. It will affect our terminology. Let's put a pin in that and we can sort that out. Maybe even do that offline in some clever way. Some other pieces that we heard was when we're presenting pathways, we maybe should be prioritizing, at least through order, those that are most impactful. We didn't solve that, but that's one idea. And certainly the way if you look at the draft outline in terms of mitigation pathways, it does start with transportation and then buildings, et cetera. And then for this last piece that we talked about, that Catherine brought up, I believe it's being addressed by this new way we're handling ready for implementation or getting rid of ready for implementation. So I believe that we will have solved this issue about big ideas that are sort of longer term ideas. They will come up and do well in our prioritization here up on what we're suggesting. So we probably will be fine and we don't need some other extra bucket. Okay, that's what I have in my sort of short notes. I'm wondering, think of all you all going to your next subcommittee meeting. Like, is it clear what's going on here if we make these changes in the PowerPoint that Jane shared around? Is this clear enough? Is there any other detail we need to suggest before we go forward? Okay, I'm going to take that as yes. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Let's try to do one more thing before we take a break, or at least we can get started on it.
David, do we want to finish the prioritization conversation with the definitions? Because we haven't done that
Oh,
yet.
excuse me. Yes, definition. Let me suggest that we do the definitions and then we take a break and come back a little bit refreshed and do the next piece, if that feels okay for everybody. So yeah, Jane, why don't you throw up those definitions and we'll see how we do on that. Sorry about that.
Okay, there's also certain comments in the chat that I'll take a stab at responding to quickly, but just want to say that pursue the equity considerations is part of the foundational criteria. And now what we're assuming is that evaluation using the guiding principles and scoring rubric will be done on all actions over the course of the next few weeks as we iron out the timeline. And then I'm not reading Billy's comments closely, so sorry. Okay. So, of course, are you guys seeing the definition screen now?
Yeah.
Not looking well on the okay. So, the crux, of course, of prioritization then is how we define these criteria and the level of specificity in which we choose to use to evaluate the criteria that we are putting forward. And so I'll walk you through as we've thought through this process, but this may require longer conversation or thought process or refinement with a group of folks to bring back. But I'm hopeful that recognizing the timeline that we're on and the choice we've now made to run all of our actions through this process, that we'll think about efficiency while not losing the importance of the criteria and the prioritization component. So again, there's 5 criteria that we've been thinking about. These largely relate back to the Global Warming Solutions Act, as well as our work through the guiding principles and just transitions in order to create and elevate 5 criteria for us to prioritize the work. So first and foremost is impact or progress towards the GWSA requirements or goals. And so it's a recognition of the consideration of action's contribution to achieving 2025, 2030, and 2050 emission reduction requirements and or resiliency, adaptation, and sequestration goals that have been developed at the subcommittees level. We're proposing simply a high, medium, and low, and we can talk about how high, medium, and low would be evaluated. But I will recognize that even for in the emissions space, we won't have like quantifiable emissions reductions for another month. And so I would argue that in some space, this will have to be done in a more simpler, less than quantified as folks might want to see for this requirement, just to keep us moving with a recognition that this is certainly a space that should be refined, if not over the course of the next few weeks with further iterations of the climate action plan, because the progress and impact of our actions certainly should be able to be measured. Equity, this would be the assistance that you would get in applying the scoring rubric, and you would apply a relative score here and how it compares, and think about how it compares against different actions in this space. Technical feasibility is what we proposed here, but there have been other definitions put forward, especially by ag and ecosystems. Early on in the process, they considered using the definition for the from the IPCC panel on feasibility. That includes 5 components of feasibility. In this case, because we have equity broken out, cost effectiveness, and other components that fold into the IPCC definition, we proposed here keeping it specifically related to technical feasibility. So is the strategy action able to be advanced at scale without additional research, technological advances, investments in supporting infrastructure. And this would be a yes or no answer, but we can certainly consider if folks are interested in having a more comprehensive definition, although it's a bit duplicative with some of our other components of the work, such as the equity screens and other things. Cost effectiveness, consideration of progress towards GWSA requirements and council goals relative to cost. And again, we're thinking about high, medium, and low. I just want to suggest that this one is not defined in the GWSA, and this really has a lot of space for you all to consider as a council how you'd like us to evaluate cost effectiveness. Certainly in our earlier template spreadsheets, as well as conversations at subcommittees, there are other things to consider with cost effectiveness. So there's the cost of inaction, cost effective to who, other things that we can build into what our commonality for definition here is for cost effectiveness. But we've proposed keeping it pretty simple here, but are open to discussion here, obviously. Co-benefits, a recognition that a really impactful action will not only meet emissions reductions, but also help us to sequester more carbon and build resilience in our communities. And so we have a high, medium, and low here based on if the action is able to accomplish multiple goals in this space. So that's a brief overview. We could probably have a whole meeting based on definition for each one of these. So, but I'm really eager to hear first impressions and or think about a process to refine them with all of you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Okay. All right, let's do just a relatively short round on this and see where we're at. Rich, want to kick us off? Jared, if we can be super to the point, it'll be very helpful.
I just offer two comments. One, on cost effectiveness, I think it's important that we consider not just what something costs, but also what it saves. And second, with respect to co-benefits, I would add some additional co-benefits in addition to the three that are listed here. I think it's important that we identify co-benefits with respect to the other major goals of the GWSA, the three listed here. But health impacts, for example, are a co-benefit of a lot of the actions we would be pursuing. And so we ought to have a broader view of co-benefits as we look at our possible actions.
Thanks,
So
Rich,
just,
for those two.
I forgot to make this comment, but I certainly support that, and we were thinking resilient in the broadest stroke of the word, and my note on the bottom of the slide says in our mind that resilience will include public health, but if there's consensus to pull it out, I think that certainly is appropriate.
Thanks. Jared, go ahead, please.
Thanks. I think overall these or at least the first few look good. My main questions and concerns are around technical feasibility and cost effectiveness. On technical feasibility, I really think we should narrow that definition to what is technologically feasible. I think some program design, rulemaking, legislative policies, they always require further research. And I can't think of, there are some things that we can do that will not require investment, either public or private, but many of them will require that. And so, for instance, I don't think we would want to say, it's not technically feasible to weatherize the homes of low-income Vermonters because it costs money, or it's not technically feasible to switch away from gasoline cars to electric vehicles because it costs money to put in the infrastructure. That to me feels more like a question of, political ease or convenience that's better sorted out by the legislature and administration. I think what our job is to put together the strategies that can work, that can add up, can meet the requirements of the law. And for me, that points to a narrower definition of technical feasibility that takes out the language around additional research, and that would take out the language around investments. Related to that, I would also just agree with what Rich said on cost effectiveness, and also say that I think that needs to be holistically defined. not just costs and savings to the consumer, but as the Public Service Department has done, a broader recognition of resource cost to the state, including, program implementation, cost to ratepayers, et cetera. And I would agree with Rich also on incorporating the cost of inaction and, to others, both future generations and otherwise in terms of the development of the social cost of carbon. That's it.
Thanks so much. Secretary Moore?
I would like to suggest maybe taking the technical feasibility definition off to the Science and Data Subcommittee for some additional work in massaging. I appreciate Jared's point. I think at least the investments in supporting infrastructure piece is an important one in terms of, I understand the cost considerations and sort of setting those aside. But I think to the extent, for example, people's homes aren't wired in a way that'll support electric vehicle charging or potentially the use of electric heat pump, that's a real concern. And we at least have to have that factor into the timeline. But this seems like an area that might be ripe for discussion at the Science and Data Subcommittee. If Jared is as co-chair, and I don't know if TJ's on the line today, would be amenable to potentially taking that up at one of our next couple of meetings.
Okay, great. Sounds like you have some work to do. Thanks. Careful with the raising your hand, Jared. All right, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, on costs, I know this is a deep rabbit hole, but I'm thinking back to all my graduate level econ courses and all, and just the deferred costs of inaction or I don't know, in being cost effective, we externalize so many costs related to greenhouse gases, and we defer so many costs to future generations. And I mean, the reality is that, again, we can go, well, if we go negative greenhouse gas emissions tomorrow, all the impacts that we've already made over the last century or so, everybody alive today is still going to suffer the consequences. So a lot of the benefits to decrease related to the greenhouse gas reduction is going to be, the direct benefits are going to be to future generations. And I don't want us to get stuck in that, but I also don't want us to lose sight of it just in trying to balance the books, because we've got to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions for the benefit, frankly, of people who aren't even alive yet and who can't speak about what their needs are. And so I hope, and again, I know we've already spoken to some, but I don't want us to lose sight of the importance of that, because at some point, I understand the importance of balancing budgets and balancing books, and but we've got to own, the full cost of the status quo, and it's not going to be easy. But anyway, I just hope we're going to keep an eye on that.
Thanks, Chris. Okay. All right. So there's a bunch of suggestions that we put on the table here. We didn't really test to see if you all are on board with these suggestions. Again, I'll just share my screen so you know the way we're capturing these. This is what I've got so far from you all right now on this issue, right? On technical feasibility, there was a suggestion, which we didn't agree to in this committee yet, but a suggestion to keep what is technically feasible, leave political, other types of considerations of the legislature, and then a suggestion to say, okay, well, let Science and Data Subcommittee work on this a little more in the face of this, all right? On cost effectiveness, include what it saves as well as what it costs. And in that, Chris's comment just now, I wrote down about let's own the full cost of the status quo, right? And then when we talk about cost effectiveness, also this holistic approach, not just very narrowly perhaps to a consumer, but also to the state in implementation, et cetera. All right, so a fairly broad definition. And finally, in co-benefits, this interest in including other co-benefits, in particular health impacts, which are contemplated in what Jane has in the slide. But if there's something else that's not there specific that folks want to say, this is really important to mention as a co-benefit, that seems like something that people want to mention. Okay, so that's what we've got. If anybody has a really negative reaction to what's on the page here, this is a good time to shout that out. Otherwise, what we can do is take this back and work on it. Secretary Young?
Thank you. Not a really negative reaction, but I would suggest that there's language in the Global Warming Solution Act that always ties, it seems, technical feasibility and cost effectiveness together. And I just want to make sure that when the subcommittee takes this up, that they do a good scrub of the statute, because I don't think we can separate out technical feasibility and cost effectiveness.
Okay. Great, thanks.
And I also would love some additional, I guess, definition around leaving the politics to the legislature. And then I heard something about leaving something to the administration and the legislature. And I think we have to be really clear around what those items mean for the council, who's been tasked, I think, with full responsibility of at least formulating the plan.
Yeah.
And looking at the how it will be financed.
Yeah,
So,
that may have been my quick note taking. It's not particularly reflective of Jared's comments. So I'm actually going to delete that particular thing and let Jared say it more the way he wanted to say it, just in case. But I think the point there is an interest in sticking to technical feasibility as one of our 5 criteria, is what I heard.
I would just quickly say, Secretary Young, I fully agree with you that cost effectiveness is really important and goes along with technical feasibility. I was just trying to say that there are many of these steps that will require the investment, some that has already been allocated and potentially future investment, and that should not preclude the recommendations from going forward.
Thanks. Okay, we got a couple more hands and then we really should go into a break. Chad, go ahead, please.
Sure, thank you. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Yeah, I just, with respect to cost effectiveness, I want to make sure that we are considering, not only what's cost effective today and tomorrow, but what is going to be increasingly cost competitive as we move forward through this decade. So the next 5, 10, 15 years. It's going to be a very dynamic playing field, and I want to make sure that the plan is able to speak to that changing playing field.
Thanks. Okay. Chris, go ahead, please.
Quick comment. Just from my experience from my board, I have to apply criteria for them to make decisions, and they all come at it from their different lenses. I know we need something to screen this, but I think since we have such a decentralized decision-making structure, there may be a lot of subjectivity introduced into this process. I don't know how to fix it, but it's just an observation.
Okay. Okay. Liz, go ahead.
Just the exchange by Jared and Secretary Young on technical feasibility, it just got to a concern I had when I reviewed this. So I'm offering it in case it's helpful when Science and Data takes it up. To me, the way it's currently phrased becomes problematic when you actually get to the parenthetical, which has parenthetical yes or no. And I wondered as I looked at it, how anything would be a yes if all 3 of those stayed together the way that they're currently framed. So to address Secretary Young's concern that they need to both be in there and may even be linked, Science and Data should consider whether, in formulating the final way technical feasibility gets looked at, there's something in that point of whether we're really trying to have a yes or a no. And if so, then I do think you need to narrow it, because otherwise we're going to end up with a list for which there is no yes. And my understanding was instead we were trying to tease out essentially where the barriers were for different proposals. And so having something narrower on technical feasibility that is really a yes, no might be helpful, so long as the cost costs and cost effectiveness, which of course includes the benefits, is captured adequately elsewhere.
Thanks, Liz. That's an interesting way to frame it. Secretary Moore?
I appreciate very much what Liz is saying there, and hope maybe the council would be willing to have science and data also come back with a recommendation about the approach to scoring. It may be high, medium, and low instead of yes or no, and give some room for exactly what Liz is flagging, which is getting to yes may be very hard in a multi-attribute function versus a high, medium, or low may actually provide more information.
That's great. Okay. All right. Good. And there's some stuff in the chat here too. Thanks everybody for that. I think we kind of got to the end of the road in terms of definitions and got some good feedback. And also we've kicked the technical feasibility piece, probably together with some cost effectiveness conversation, to the science and data subcommittee. So that's helpful. Let me suggest the following. It's 8 minutes past the hour now. I wonder if folks mind taking a slightly shortened break and come back at 3:20, and we'll pick up where we left off. We're gonna have to crunch up time just a little bit, but we'll come back at 3:20 and pick up on the drafting process proposal. And so take a 12-minute break, and we'll see you back at 3:20, and see you in just a few minutes. Thanks, everybody. All right.
I'm helping you out, David, by putting my camera on momentarily.
Wonderful. Thanks, June. Appreciate it.
Then I'm going to have to turn it off again, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Signal here is just abysmal.
Yep. All right. Okay. So thanks, everyone. Sorry that was kind of a little shorter than usual. Just before we get going into the process piece, I want to make sure that Jane's got a mandate here and to take the concerns that were raised around the definitions of the criteria, but the ones, if there weren't other concerns raised right now, basically let's keep rolling forward with what we've got is what I'm hearing. So I just want to double check that there isn't some lingering concern out there that hasn't been expressed, because we're moving faster and we need to make sure that we know exactly the things we need to work on. Okay, great. Okay, so now the next piece on this is a process for drafting and reviewing the climate action plan text. This has the history of last week and what happened in the steering committee meeting and some of those palpable tensions I referenced at the beginning of the meeting and Secretary Moore also made reference to. As a result of that meeting, Jane was asked to come up with a proposal for drafting and reviewing the climate action plan by December 1. And a number of documents are attached to the agenda to help lay that out. And I will turn it over to Jane, who has a PowerPoint that sort of gives the overview of it. And then I'm actually going to take a moment and we're going to sit and just quietly read ourselves to make sure we've looked at these documents. But Jane, why don't you kick us off by walking us through the basics?
Yeah, thank you, David. Let's see if this goes. So mindful of the processes at play, I'd like to sort of walk through the drafting process and timeline, as David suggested, that you'll all have a chance to review more closely if you haven't between now and Friday when it was posted online. And then also suggest where I still see gaps and need for further identification of process with all of you today in refining some of the obvious gaps that we still have in thinking about how we pull together the climate action plan by December 1st. So just hearkening back to what both Secretary Moore and David said early on is that this moment that we're in, really less than 90 days to go, calls for an all hands on deck. And my hope and impression is after today's conversation that we will all agree and recognize that the proposal will be supported with staff support, but much of that substantive content will be drafted at subcommittee levels, also drawing on and recognizing the immense expertise that you all have sitting here on the council, and hope to be able to pull on in and support in drafting the text. We are going to need a process that is clear so that you can all see your roles in review, editing, and drafting, but that's also agile and allows us to be a bit flexible as we move to December 1st. And I just hope that as you look at the process and calls explicitly around timeline and dates, that you'll really see that the council will have the ability to review, adapt, and approve all of the text for the climate action plan on an iterative timeline, so that as the whole comprehensive draft is pulled together at the end of November, there won't be any surprises. You will have had a chance all along the way to see the components, as well as see how comments are revised, because I do just want to speak to, before I go through this closely, one of the things when you do look at the document that wasn't as clear as I should have been is that there's a timeline that speaks to the different drafting sections, as well as how comments will be received and put back out. But I also want to create the expectation that there will be clear communication of how comments were incorporated, where they weren't and why, and how we'll do that based on the support of staff in moving those forward on behalf of subcommittees and counselors. So what I want to do just really briefly is walk through the three sections, the three main sections of the CAP, and highlight the key components of those related to the introduction, the pathways, and then the implementation section, articulate primary responsibility for drafting of each of those sections. So the introduction is really in the outline, because one of the questions we'll ask you today is really about how if the CAP outline is still hitting the mark with all of you based on where we are now and what you know is coming. And so just recognizing that that process will continue to evolve and we'll continue to check in about the CAP outline. For now, I would just want to clearly describe what those sections comprise. So in the beginning, the introduction, we're really building the case for why, that case for action around a number of sections built based on components of the GWSA, the requirements, the goals, and the effects of climate change in Vermont. We'll speak to the requirements specifically and how we're addressing them, and then really build on the foundational work that we've done to build the plan. That's speaking to the guiding principles, the prioritization work, public engagement, as well as the science and data needs that we've been working towards. Many of these sections you'll note are really going to be drafted by counselors as lead authors, and then subcommittees with support state staff articulated around them. The next section, which is really the meat of the plan, the pathways or the goals, if we choose to move that way, are comprised of the four sections. I want to say that this is where that we'll have to have some resolution and conversation around process later on. But there's still this component, and you'll see in the CAP outline a new section at the beginning of this that speaks to an overview and synthesis of the pathways, and calls right at the front and center of this section the cross-cutting pathways for attention. So a recognition of where we have pathways that are touching on mitigation, sequestration, and resilience and adaptation as well, and speaking to those right up in front. This is really the bulk of this work is drafted by subcommittees, all for mitigation, sequestration, and resilience and adaptation. And where you'll see on this plan, and we have even more details specific to share with subcommittees, there are specific state staff assigned to support the task leads associated with each of these work in helping subcommittees roll up and synthesize their efforts. I also would just, again, highlight that the cross-cutting pathways has been an area that really needs some discussion still and is not completely clear based on the timeline and draft outline that we have up online. And at the end of this, I'll suggest an idea on how to move forward. The implementation section really speaks to just that, a synthesis of all the work that's come before it, and then speaks to how we're going to measure and track progress, as well as all the guidance documents around that are necessary in a plan around appendices, acknowledgements, definitions. Largely, the guidance documents can be compiled on behalf of the council by state staff supporting the project. The measuring and tracking progress will have support through the consultants with respect to the mitigation space, but there'll also be a task group in science and data looking to create recommendations on how we further advance this work in future iterations in the resilience, adaptation, and sequestration space. The implementation section, I would argue, will be the hardest to pull together and synthesize, largely not living with any one subcommittee, and therefore really needs, I think, direct counselor engagement with supporting and working with state staff to help carry those sections forward in a timely manner to bring to the council for review and conversation. So right now, what we're thinking about as you turn your attention to the documents for cross-cutting ideas and implementation is not dissimilar from some of the components proposed in the CAP drafting process that was discussed with the steering committee last week. But really, now that we've proposed a timeline and an outline for how it'll be drafted, it's really a recognition that that only gets us so far, and that we still need a process with all of you around how we're going to deal with those these two components. So we want to keep that substantive conversations around policies as much as we can with subcommittees. That's where the expertise lies. But we also know that there's going to be a recognition of pulling some of those ideas and trying to think about how we elevate those in the CAP and how we clearly discuss them and raise their importance. And so we're suggesting that a small task team, not dissimilar from how subcommittees have worked with task leads, can pull on and draw from that expertise with all of you to speak to and bring together expertise in the resilience, adaptation, sequestration, and mitigation expertise to work very closely with Marion and I to be thinking about how we further refine the CAP and elevate these ideas and create clear process for the subcommittees to show how they're going to be reflected in the plan as we move to compile and incorporate ideas coming from multiple subcommittees. We also see this task team as working closely with drafters to communicate back to subcommittees and ultimately the council with these updated outlines. So based on that, which we'll sort of come back to and revisit as a process to deal with those two major components of the CAP outline, David suggested that we would take some time to read over the timeline and outline to think about these questions as you do, which is, does the current CAP outline provide enough detail to understand the tasks ahead to draft it? And as a counselor, really, because we've heard this concern loud and clear, does this give you a sense of your role in reviewing and editing as well as primary drafting where appropriate? And do you support the proposed approach for addressing cross-cutting issues? And I will suggest that that probably needs a little more discussion with all of you after you've had a chance to look at the CAP outline and the timeline. So I'll pause there and turn it back over to David to suggest next steps.
Super. Thanks, Jane. Nice overview. I do think since these documents were posted the end of last week, or even is the weekend, I'm not sure exactly when these went up, that we can take a moment and just sit for a second with them. I don't mind if it's quiet, we're all on mute. We take 3 minutes or something and we scan through it. I just put one of them in the chat. They're all listed in the agenda as well. The one that sort of walks through the CAP outline with assignments is the one I just put in the chat. And then the other one is the timeline, which I'll drop in the chat as well. And I would ask each of you to click on these right now, or if you haven't printed out or wherever you're reading stuff, and let's just take some minutes to read for a second. So I'm going to go quiet for a couple minutes. It's 3:33, 3:35, 3:36. I'll come back in and let's just read. If anybody's confused about what I'm asking you to read through, just let me know. I'll post it again in the chat if you're having a hard time in your phone. And Jane had some specific questions there for us. Secretary Young, you have your hand up?
It would be helpful
in terms of what we've entitled these documents, you've been referring to a CAP outline. And what we have is CAP drafting assignments, and we have CAP drafting deadlines.
Yeah.
Is it one of those two?
It's both of those. And so the assignments is the first one I put in the chat. Absolutely. Yeah, that's right. Sorry about that. That's the right name. The CAP drafting assignments, and then the CAP drafting timeline is the other one. Those are the two documents. Just take another minute and make sure you've looked through both documents. Thanks so much. Okay. I hope that was useful time to sit with these documents again, even if you'd read them previously. Let's take a round of comments and see what we want to do about it, just like we've been doing in these other sections of the agenda. Jared, go ahead. I'm Secretary Young. Is that that's an old hand or is that a new hand?
That is old.
Okay, no worries. No worries. Thanks. Jared, go ahead. Please.
Thanks, David. And first, I just really want to thank Jane, and then also I see real. It's very obvious that a lot of the dedicated work that Lauren and Chris and Leslie Ann and Secretary Moore had put in terms of the earlier process of coming up with the drafting plan is very much reflected in this outline and this presentation. So I just want to thank all of them and Jane for this. I think that what you presented, Jane, looks really good overall. And I think I agree with most all of it. I do want to focus on your question, though. I think there are a few pieces that would benefit from additional clarity. And if we can establish that sooner rather than later, I think that'll help us throughout the process. So the first piece of clarity that I think would really help is with regard to, sorry, let me just find it, the CAP outline assignments. I think for each of these, we should put specific names rather than just identifying a task group. And I know that that might be difficult to do right now, but I think that that's where we need to get to as a council. Perhaps that can be taken up by the steering committee with the input of the subcommittees. But I think that for clarity of who is on first, who is on point, and who's really responsible as the primary author for different sections, even if that person isn't doing the drafting, but is the point person for making sure the content is right and receiving the suggested revisions when they come in. I think we want those specific names identified. So that would be one piece. And I'm happy to pause there. I also have some feedback on the draft outline. And that would be that I think it's just I assume it's just a typo or an oversight, but section 10 is missing, I believe, from the drafting deadlines and timeline. So I think it's just a missing number there. I would also specifically request that in the revision process, that folks who submit comments are able to see not just the first draft that they're commenting on, but a track change draft after. Not that that's what's going to be published, but I think it will be important for transparency to see what was taken into account and changed versus what was not taken on board by that person. And then lastly, I think going back to this question of primary authors, I think we really want to be clear. My understanding of this, and I just want to check this, is that the primary authors are those individuals identified for different sections of the climate action plan. So Dr. Dupini-Giroux for the effects of climate change on Vermont, Joey as the counselor who's the transportation task lead, for instance, for the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee for the transportation recommendations. My understanding, based on my understanding of primary author, is that the suggested revisions would go to them to be either approved or incorporated, and that's what's meant by primary author. Is that right as well?
Yes, that's right. And I will say that just speaking here, we do have a second draft of this outline that includes, specific task leads with their specific state staff support. And my intention is based on, after this conversation, is to share those respective more detailed draft assignments with subcommittees so that folks can see where their name is, who they're with, and sort of suss out primary roles, drafting roles and responsibilities. And yes, just not adding section 10 into the timeline was an oversight, but we'll put it in.
Sorry, I was on mute. Rich, go ahead, please.
In general, I appreciate the work done to organize the draft and to assign, begin the process of assigning lead authors for each section. I think that's a really productive way to go. And I really like the idea that counselors would be responsible for individual sections, and that state staff would be identified who could really help them pull it together. So all of that is terrific. I think we will have to do some form of version control. Jared's right that we want to be transparent about how authors or lead authors for a section either take on board or amend comments that are made to them. But at some point we'll have 1 million comments, and we might just want to archive that one and go to version 2, and so that people can just track it as it goes. I have a couple of questions when maybe a comment about the implementation section and the cross-cutting ideas section. My first reaction was to think that the cross-cutting of the 4 major sections listed there, that cross-cutting should come forth. That is, we go through mitigation, resilience, adaptation, and then pull it together with a look across all of that with the clusters of actions that we think kind of fall out of those sections. And that's probably how cross-cutting will be derived anyway. So I would suggest putting it forth, not first. I like, Jane, your suggestion that the authorship of that section should be driven by a small committee of people who are coming from the different committees, whose work would be involved in that, in the first place. And that, right now we don't know who those people are, but probably that's how it should be derived. And then finally, just a nomenclature thing, the section titled implementation, to me, it's a wrong title, because all of the action steps higher up in the document have the implementation kind of built into them. And I think what's meant by that section on implementation, as I read the details of it, I don't have a good terminology. I apologize, I haven't fixed it. It's basically, supporting framework for implementation. For example, workforce development is something that is essential and cuts across a variety of these action areas, and a policy around workforce development, or a policy around the allocation of federal dollars, obviously is important as part of a supporting framework, but implementation of major action steps should be built into the discussion of those actions themselves in prior chapters. Yeah. So there's some terminology fix there, but I appreciate that you're trying to call out essential framework actions and policies that are going to be needed to make any of the actions higher in the list actually come to pass.
Thanks,
That's
Rich.
it.
That's helpful. Thanks so much. Leslie Ann, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, David. And thanks, Jane, for pulling this document together. I just had a point of clarification on number 4 with the effects of climate change piece in there that Jay and I are going to be working on. There's a sub part that talks about the implication of continuing in business as usual. And I'm just looking for clarification. That's where a lot of the economic pieces are going to be brought to bear, because as physical and natural scientists, that's outside of our bailiwick, because we're going to be doing more of the physical climate pieces. And so the business as usual would probably come from somewhere else. So just to lift that up and put a pin in it in terms of who's actually providing that expertise, because it's outside of my area of expertise. And since I'm just looking at this, if we could remove the C from Jay's last name, that would be super awesome.
Thanks, Leslie Ann. Yeah, can I get Jane, can you mention just real quick on the, the business as usual piece, what is the vision there? Is that something that we'll have some other help on? What Leslie Ann's mentioning there?
the business as usual piece is something that is done in partnership with the Public Service Department and was the base for our LEAP modeling. So yes, we will have a business as usual model and report on that we can draw on for incorporation in the CAP.
Okay, great. Thanks. Bram, please go ahead.
Thanks. I have two questions. One is the plan is going to include a lot of actions, and I don't really understand. I don't see in the process where the steps of estimating how much each action is going to cost, and then where the money is going to come from to pay for that.
Yeah. So we're going to have a conversation on Friday, further refining our understanding of, well, not further refining, bringing everybody, a small group of some of the science and data folks leading the economics charge, as well as our joint fiscal committee, to look at what we'll get from our economic analysis, which is really a high level macro analysis of impacts on the economy, but where we know we need to go, which is a policy level economics analysis that won't be done for this climate action plan, but will definitely be prioritized as we develop this climate action plan as next steps with respect to the technical analysis work that we'll do.
Great, thanks. I'm just thinking if we want to weatherize 150,000 houses at $10,000 each, that's $1.5 billion, and it's a lot of money, and it needs to come from somewhere. And my second question is, in the outline, I wonder if it would be helpful to readers coming to this from all different directions. If we did a section on how Vermont's plan fits in with what other states are doing, fits in with national work, and fits in with global work.
That's a great suggestion, and one that was actually brought up a bit through the CAP drafting process too, as thoughts of how we tie to other work and other efforts. And so, yeah, I think that there's definitely a place for that, and we'll think about how to do that correctly.
Super. Thanks, Bram. Chris?
Oops. Yeah, I'm just going to wear my municipal interest hat here for a second. There's one cross-cutting issue that I think we're going to have to address. And I'm saying this based on participation in a few different subcommittee meetings last week. And that's for items where it's assuming some level of government action or reporting or planning or something like that. I know we're talking about having, like, I think like land use is one of those cross-cutting issues that we've discussed, but there's the theory about where things happen, and there's the reality of where things happen. And I think we're going to need to have a section in the plan, and we may not be able to do this, certainly by December 1st, but it's one of those items that we're going to need to, continue working on, which is where are things likely to happen, or in a real world scenario, where will they happen? I'll use an example. Last week, a couple of times I heard, well, towns can do this in their town plans. And this was looking for some critical information about critical infrastructure. Well, for one thing, towns choose to do a plan. They don't have to do one. Second, they don't necessarily have to even do what statute or anything else says. Regions can approve town plans, but that's really the only thing they get are some, access to some grant programs. And if they don't necessarily need those or want those, they can do whatever they want. There's no real gatekeeper there. So, and just looking at things like river corridors and other things like that have been deferred to towns, which are like critical life safety policy issues, sometimes just don't have either the political or administrative capacity to do it. And I'm only bringing this up because I've seen a lot of good policy kind of die by getting pushed off to levels of government that really, frankly, don't have the capacity or may not have the will to do it. So I just want to flag that as an important conversation that the council needs to have. And I'm happy to, I'd like to be a part of those discussions. And I'm not trying to help towns, avoid the hard work they need to do, but just remember a lot of the work that we assume they're going to do is frankly optional for them. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thanks, Chris. That's helpful. Abby?
Yes, I just wanted to again flag the concern that I rose earlier about the deliverables for ag and ecosystems on 9/21 not being ready until 9/24. And then also, I just am noticing that there's a lot of places where co-chairs are listed as responsible for the drafting components. And I'm wondering if it can be listed as the ag and ecosystem subcommittee. And I'm sensing maybe that might be the case for rural resilience and just this wasn't something that I was aware of as a component of being a co-chair. And so I just would love the right to delegate responsibility to another counselor within a subcommittee if I need to, based on time constraints, given my job.
Thanks, Abby. Catherine had sent a similar comment in the chat. So I
Right.
think
Yep.
you're in
And
company there.
Gina, I think flagged something similar. So just if there could be a bit of flexibility written in as to how the subcommittees determine who is taking up various pieces, that would be really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Joey?
Thanks. Just want to echo what Abby is suggesting and just thank you all for this work and thank Leslie Ann and Chris and Lauren in particular for helping to catalyze it and clarify. And it seems like we're moving in a really great direction. One of the things I just wanted to ask really gets to what Chris Campany was raising, and it's sort of like, we've again, where's the venue for having that conversation about the sort of enabling things that will make this possible, like the capacity at our regional planning commissions, capacity in state government, the funding components. We've talked a little bit about that, but I think it's really critical. We have identified some of those things in our transportation task group as fundamental to making this, endeavor possible. And then also tied to the really great conversation earlier about in gratitude for the Just Transitions work and the principles and the rubric. I also think, I'd love to see the state of Vermont advance an environmental justice policy. And I think that would provide us in our collective work an overarching frame. Because I think this work that we're doing is in broader service to the state of Vermont than just, what the statute is requiring us to do. So I just want to have us be thinking about if there are efficient ways or important ways to create overarching structures that enable this and create an environment for this to be more cohesive and connected and in service of a general direction that we want to move as a state, then I would love for there to be a venue to have those conversations. And governmental capacity and people power to do the work at key organizations like our community action agencies, RPCs. And, again, just echoing, I'd love to see us support an environmental justice policy for the state of Vermont and our recommendations. And I just don't see a venue to have those more overarching conversations.
Thanks, Joey. Interesting. Lauren, and then we'll swing back to Chris, and then let's see where we're at.
I made a recommendation a few meetings ago, and I don't know if it was at steering committee or full council. I apologize for how dry the recommendation is, but I think there needs to be a space in the climate action plan that describes the actual planning process and structure that we've been a part of for the past year. Just to it's really archival and it's like the worst part of a plan, but I think that needs to be incorporated. So if somebody wants to look at this plan in 10 years and know what we did and how we did it, that can be kind of taken out from the plan. So I'd again recommend that we create a section for that in this plan.
Thanks, Lauren. Yep. Okay, Chris took a handout. Okay, great. So, all right, so we got a bunch of feedback here. Some of it more substantial than others. What I have on my notes, which are too messy to share, frankly, in terms of CAP outline assignments, there is another version with names on it that Jane has. And we've just heard that co-chairs are particularly concerned about the ability for them to delegate to somebody else. So what there is a request that that be developed by the co-chairs themselves and the subcommittees, but we'll get to a place on who's on first. And related to that, when we do settle in on primary authors, that those primary authors indeed are the ones who take comments in and try to make adjustments and have that revision responsibility. We had some conversation about cross-cutting issues. Chris brought up an issue about where things actually happen. It was expanded to talk about, what Joey just said about sort of overall enabling conditions and questions like, do we have the space to have those conversations? So we're hearing that, and I'm not quite sure, Jane, you may have some thoughts about this, but there is an intent to pull this task group together to talk about cross-cutting issues and figure out how we make sense of what's been going on in the subcommittees. I don't know how that addresses, Joey, your concern about like putting whole new issues on the table. I honestly don't know how that might happen. Okay, there's some other specific requests, which I'm not going to go through, but those are sort of the big ones that require some work. Jane, is there anything else you want to say about this right now, given what you've heard?
No, they've all been really great suggestions that many of which will be simple changes that we can work to incorporate.
Right. Abby?
Just really quickly, following up on Joey's suggestion, I did just want to note that I do believe it was suggested at our last Ag and Eco subcommittee meeting to put forward a recommendation to the legislature to follow up on Senator Rahm's environmental justice bill that she's been putting forward for a number of years now. So it is potentially going to be called out in that way as an action strategy. Whether we want to call it up further as an overarching theme, I'll leave that up to the better sense of the council, but we are beginning the discussion of that at our subcommittee level.
Thanks, Abby. Kelly?
Hi, I have a small thing, which is that I noticed that we use the term goals in section 5 of this, that it says measurable sequestration, adaptation, and resilience goals. And that was something that was brought up earlier as maybe we don't want to use that word. And maybe in this context it's appropriate, but I just wanted to flag that if we're deciding if we call them, goals or pathways or what. And just also, I'm on the same page with some of the things that Jared and Lauren said about just making sure things are really transparent and that we can say, yes, you were heard, even if something doesn't end up in the final draft. I think that's going to be really important for us for public support.
Thanks, Kelly. That's great. Just on the question of the word goals, in that reference, it means something else. It's not synonymous with pathways in that reference. It's trying to get at that, what we talked about previously, how mitigation, we've got legally binding targets, and with sequestration, adaptation, resilience, the subcommittees have been thinking about how they may create some goals that would be what they're moving towards, but that's different than the pathways. Yeah. Secretary Moore?
Sure. I just wanted to follow up on Abby's comment about environmental justice. I think there's a lot of work underway at ANR, and it may be helpful to the extent the council is contemplating a recommendation in that space to understand sort of the initiatives that are already underway at the agency, and would welcome the opportunity to see those sort of buttressed and supported through the plan.
Super. Okay, great. Okay. The next steps on this is to get some volunteers for this task group that would be particularly involved in the cross-cutting piece that Jane talked about. Jane, you would put a suggested deadline for the end of this week if you want to raise your hand and be part of that. We are looking for, the process is looking for diversity of voices across the substantive areas of the subcommittees, right? So that's really finding that balance is going to be important for that group to work well. Jane, do you want to say anything else about the next steps on this?
My suggestion was that we could bring that forward to the steering committee next Tuesday for conversation about the right distribution and diversity of that committee, recognizing that I do just want to say that the expectation for time commitment. Marianne and I discussed, I know we are often not wanting to put time commitments, but I would suggest, as folks are thinking about throwing their name in the hat, a realistic expectation over the course of the next few months would be upwards of 8 hours a week on that committee, really thinking about drafting responsibilities and thought process and work together. So I don't think that might be light ask of time.
So please do think if that feels like something you'd want to be engaged with, reach out directly to Jane, and then by the end of the week, and then next week in the steering committee, we can solidify that. Okay, great. Just making sure, Secretary Moore, that's an old hand versus a new hand. Okay, great. Okay, super. Thank you, everybody. It seems like we're getting down the right road, and it's just a little daunting how it's coming crushing down upon us. The final thing we wanted to do today, in addition to some updates and public comment, but substantive piece, is around greenhouse gas accounting. And I apologize, Jared, because I think you had given us different language to put in this in the agenda, and we kept it as greenhouse gas accounting. Jane, were you going to share Jared's slides on this?
I actually have my computer now, so I can go ahead and share
Perfect.
them.
Okay, so Ray, you may need to be a co-host. Just Marion can help you with that.
Okay, try to share, and then can you see the slides now? Okay, great. Let me just move this so I can start the slideshow. Okay, great. So good to see everyone. Again, just for some context setting, I'm doing this presentation in my role as co-chair of the Science and Data Subcommittee and as one of the task leads on the greenhouse gas inventory and supplemental accounting review task group of that subcommittee. And we recently received a report with recommendations from Energy Futures Group and CADMIS after their review of Vermont's existing greenhouse gas emissions inventory and ways that could be improved over time, and supplemental analysis that could be undertaken to ensure that we're getting as full and transparent a way of measuring what greenhouse gas emissions we can fairly be understood to be responsible for, and to make sure that when we are recommending pathways, strategies, and actions, we are confident that they are doing the job of actually reducing emissions. So just for some context setting, this will look very familiar. This is very similar to the last presentation at the council that lists the subcommittee members of the Science and Data Subcommittee and the state staff support, just by way of introduction again. And specifically, I would note that of the task group that spent the most time with this, it was Colin Smythe, who is at the Department of Environmental Conservation, the lead author of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and then myself and Richard Hopkins as well, and then the full subcommittee discussed these recommendations as well. So this is kind of the process to date. We identified in the very early stages of designing an RFI and then an RFP the need to have a comprehensive review of Vermont's greenhouse gas emissions inventory and to identify options for supplemental accounting. And that was framed up as task one for the consultants that we've been working with, and was the first draft report that we received from Energy Futures Group and CADMIS. And that full report was attached in the meeting materials for today and is available on the website. We met early. Colin provided a lot of the background documents and assumptions and methodology that go into the existing inventory. We discussed the kind of comparison states that we wanted to look at, and some of the key questions that we wanted to see in the research design and literature review. And then so we got back in early August from Energy Futures Group the draft report, received both task group and full subcommittee feedback, and we then received a week turnaround the revised report, and which also received public comment. And then we drafted up a 2-page set of summary recommendations to the council, which you all also saw as an attachment, which I'm going to go through. But it basically says, we have reviewed this report. We agree with its findings and recommendations. We are forwarding it to the full council for adoption. And in particular, here are some key recommendations and next steps that we want to call out. And so that unanimous agreement was gained at the Science and Data Subcommittee on September 1st. And so that's why we're presenting it now. So let me just go through the specific recommendations that we are highlighting for you. Is first, to maintain and continue, and I want to really underline and emphasize this, maintain doesn't mean we just keep using the same methodology year after year. We also identify the need to continue to update and improve the existing sector-based in-boundary methodology. This is very important for consistency and alignment with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and also for tracking and comparison with other states, and in terms of the methodology that is used by the Environmental Protection Agency. Additionally, second, that we should continue to report on gross emissions in compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act, while also working to improve how we track and report net emissions, including emission sinks. I don't want anybody to think that this set of recommendations is all that will come forward with regard to how we track and report our greenhouse gas emissions. This is a start. There will be further recommendations that come out of that carbon budget or task 2 report. And consistent with the number 1 above, we also anticipate that there will be sector-specific improvements to methodology that will be identified and recommended. I know, for instance, that the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee is working with Dr. Jillian Galford at UVM, who is the task lead in terms of updates and improvements to how we measure emissions from the agricultural sector in particular, and is also involved with the carbon budget development and review. That is all anticipated and not just allowed for, but encouraged in this set of recommendations here. Third, that it will be important for our existing inventory to include supplemental information and sensitivity analysis. So as part of the next in-boundary greenhouse gas inventory that the state publishes. That should include information about biogenic greenhouse gases, and more information on that will come forward, I believe, with the task 2 carbon budget recommendations, but also to enable transparent analysis of and different lenses on how we can understand where our emissions come from and the impact of them, including additional analysis of the global warming potential of greenhouse gases, and enabling people to see the different emissions factors and the results of what they would add up to in terms of our sources of emissions using different assessment report values from the IPCC. To date, Vermont has mostly used AR4 values, but we know that it would be beneficial and we should be able to see the results using AR5 values, and when they are ready, AR6 values. Fourth recommendation is that we maintain renewable energy credit accounting as the basis for calculating electricity sector emissions. This is in line with regional policies and regulations and with the renewable energy standard in terms of, and this is the way that every state in New England does it except for New Hampshire, and I believe that may be changing, but we are looking at the emissions caused from our electricity consumption and purchases, not the in-state, not just the electricity that is generated in-state. And that is important because we consume more electricity than we generate in-state, which includes imported purchased power. There are likely improvements to how we do that electricity sector accounting with RECs including following some of the path-breaking work that the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Conservation has done for REC values in the ISO New England region. And then another key recommendation from EFG that we agreed with was to adopt key category analysis for future inventories. So those are the 5 key recommendations that with regard to our existing inventory, but there is another set of key recommendations and next steps that would go a step farther than that. And let me pivot to those, and then we can take some questions and discussion. Our existing inventory is designed, as is the case with the greenhouse gas emissions inventory of almost every state and country in the world, to as accurately as possible determine what emissions we are responsible for from within Vermont's borders. It is known as an in-boundary or a sector-based inventory. In the Global Warming Solutions Act, it notes the importance of measuring the life cycle emissions related to the use of energy in Vermont, including those emissions that occur outside the boundaries of the state. Part of the challenge is that is not currently done, and it is not an off-the-shelf, obvious option of how to do that. And so we are recommending that we move forward with designing a request for information that would surface and get responses to questions related to how we would conduct either an upstream and or life cycle accounting, and that definition will matter, so that we can estimate that and be more transparent and fully comprehensive in that. And we want to make sure that it includes discussion of bounding and boundaries and key clarity on definitions. And really importantly, as Secretary Moore helped highlight, different paths are going to require or implicate different amounts of resources, either in terms of staff time or budget. And so we want to surface as much information as possible about what it would cost to do this supplemental analysis or the different options that may be put forward. Once we have gotten those RFI responses, both the Science and Data Subcommittee and ANR leadership propose that we will work together to identify, taking all that information in, what the suggested definitions might be, what the options available might be, what the costs might be, to then identify the next steps to design and conduct an upstream and or life cycle accounting of emissions related to the use of energy in Vermont. And then there's that last point that we want to make sure that when that is done, it is able to be updatable, flexible, accessible by the Agency of Natural Resources, because it will have to be stewarded and updated over time, not just into the future, but we also want to be able to, as much as possible, compare in previous years and have baseline years in terms of seeing how things have changed. And I believe that is it. I just want to really thank the members of the Science and Data Subcommittee who paid attention to this, put a lot of work and thought into it. Great work in the report that was done by EFG, especially David Hill and Elizabeth Bourget. Again, I think it's important to emphasize that this is an initial set of recommendations. We do not in any way intend for it to preclude further recommendations that should come forward relating to the carbon budget or relating to improvements in how we can and more accurately assess the emissions from different sectors, including the agriculture sector, which we know is an ongoing conversation, and would welcome and encourage further recommendations on that in particular.
Thanks, Jared. Super great. Okay. So in the interest of time, let me just put this, are there any sort of screaming concerns out there with the way that Jared's put this forward? Abby, do you want to speak to this?
Yes, I just wanted to sort of tie into some of what Jared alluded to, and appreciation for that, Jared. We really appreciate all of the work that's gone into what Science and Data has put forward in developing these recommendations. And, but in order to be in better alignment with the IPCC approach, They still are not taking into account the recommendations that the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee has tried to bring forward. And we just are asking that, you know, I am asking as the farm and forest sector representative that we move forward with the GHG inventory as Jared is discussing, with the exception of the ag sector, in order to give the Science and Data Subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee a chance to meet and get some of this better resolved with the work of Dr. Galford before she leaves on maternity leave before the December 1st deadline. Thank you.
Okay, Abby. So just to be clear then, what you're saying is before we get our plan together in the coming weeks, you're hopeful that Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee will have something of a enhanced proposal that complements what Jared's put out there.
Yes, we have a draft recommendation at this point, but because of sort of the siloed nature of work that's been happening within the subcommittees, this hasn't been something that's been able to be addressed appropriately based on the various concerns within our subcommittee and, you know, frankly, by me as the farm and forest sector representative. And so I am wishing for those concerns to be allayed and for the accurate accounting to be noted before we move forward with the way that it is drafted for ag emissions.
Okay. All right. Are there other things that are screaming out there that we need to address right now before giving kind of this tentative, okay, looks good, keep moving to Jared and the Science and Data Subcommittee? Anything else that's jumping out at folks? Liz?
I guess I just need clarity on your comment, David, about tentative, okay, looks good, move forward. And so this might be a more general comment than just specific to the GHG inventory. But as Jared and others know, I have read both the first draft and the second draft, and, you know, do have some thoughts on the draft and the recommendations, but I don't understand what you're asking the council to do today and what its effect will be. And I feel like that's important. So I don't have a specific concern with the slides Jared just presented, and I understand that they accurately reflect what science and data put forward and the report that they received, but I don't understand what we're supposed to do or what effect you think our kind of general agreement today would have.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wonder, Jared, if you can say a few words about the impact of moving forward with the recommendations you say today, what impact that has on our plan or our planning.
Yeah. I think there's a few things. One is it gives us the clarity to move forward with in drafting an RFI so that we can begin the process of being able to speak to more transparently some of the upstream and life cycle emissions concerns, which I think is really important to begin as soon as possible. And we already know that the likely resulting accounting there will probably not be, almost definitely not be ready by the December 1st climate action plan. But we don't want that to be an excuse for delaying getting that analysis done as soon as possible, because there are legitimate kind of questions and that should be kind of factored into the ongoing process after the initial plan has been submitted and we continue refining it. You know, I would defer to Secretary Moore and Colin if he is on at this point in terms of the implications for the way that ANR and DEC can go ahead in terms of conducting the next greenhouse gas inventory. But I know that that is an ever-present question, and clarity for that process would likely be very beneficial as well.
Secretary Moore?
So Jared makes an important point. I don't know that we're in a position to implement a different methodology right now, but I do think continuing to move apace with the RFI is really the sort of the critical path item to my mind. This is going to provide the information for us to make recommendations. And would just like to encourage Abby and the Ag and Ecosystems Committee to really think about how to integrate some of the issues they've flagged in that RFI. I see that as the critical next step, and really the thing that I think the Science and Data Subcommittee is looking for a general support from the council to move ahead with at this point, acknowledging that there's some real reasons we track the emissions the way we do right now. There are some real opportunities to potentially take a more expansive view, and we would collectively, I think, benefit from the type of information we would get back from an RFI in deciding whether to move forward with an RFP, some sense of how much a change in practice would cost to implement, and be able to ultimately bring back to the council a more fulsome recommendation.
Okay. Liz, does that help clarify?
Sorry, I hit hand rather than mute. I'm not sure it actually does. I mean, so I get and appreciate the need to move forward with the RFI, and I don't have any problem with that work moving forward. My question was really more about, again, bigger picture, not so much related to the GHG report itself, but when I appreciate, David, your consensus-based approach, and I think that's what you're aiming for. And I'm concerned about where that puts us from a clarity point of view, when what was on the agenda today was something about the council's general consensus to move forward with the recommendations, which is a set of 6 or whatever recommendations arising out of a very long report that has been revised once. So if the question on the table is, do I as a counselor support a draft RFI being put together so that can get out to technical consultants to help inform a later potential RFP process? Yes, that's great. I understand the need to move forward with that work, and there will be kind of questions answered along the way. If the question is instead, do I or any other counselor support and endorse, I guess, the full set of recommendations as drafted along with the report, that's just a different question that I'm not sure the format and way we've presented it here allows me anyway to say, oh yes, definitely, just from a process point of view. So that's why I'm trying to get clarity.
Okay. Yeah, I think from my standpoint, it's trying to be clear about the implications of this for your work as a council. And so the implications, as I understand it, is the greenhouse gas accounting methodology should go forward in the way it's been suggested in these recommendations. And there's a need to do this additional work because there's these things that it doesn't cover that we want it to cover, but it's hard to figure out how to do it. And that's what I understand the recommendations to be. And the implications for you as a council is that's the accounting that you're going to have at your disposal now. You're setting wheels in motion so that you can address these other concerns in the future. That's what I'm trying. That's what I understand the implications are, and looking for the council to say, yep, that looks like the right pathway.
Yeah, and it's that, so I can take it offline and talk with you and Jane, and
right.
I don't want to take more time now. I don't understand whether we are today adopting this set of recommendations or just saying keep going. And that's two different things. And I think it matters from a transparency and record point of view. If other counselors don't share the concern, then we certainly can move on.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, Liz. So I appreciate the wanting clarity on it. Rich and then Secretary Young.
I'm agreeing with Liz that it's a little unclear exactly what we're being asked to sign off on. In general, I would support a conclusion that we should continue to do the accounting the way we've been doing it for this plan, because we don't really have time to change the way we're doing the accounting while we're preparing this plan. But Ag and ecosystems have said that they want an opportunity to weigh in on that issue. And I'd like to hear what they have to say before we decide as a group on that bottom line question. And I agree with others, commenting that the idea of going forward with an RFI makes total sense, and we should examine further different ways of doing the accounting. recognizing that there are a lot of complexities in that area. I don't think it's going to be it's not going to be easy to pick and choose amongst out of boundary impacts and decide which ones we want to count as consequential to Vermont's policymaking.
Right.
But there are ways to parse it that may emerge from an examination. I don't have any problem with the RFI.
Yeah, okay. Great. Let's take a few more comments and then see where we stand. Secretary Young?
I think Rich articulated what I was, my takeaway from reading the reports over the weekend was there's no recommendation in there that we change anything for now, but there are suggestions in there that we examine different ways of doing the accounting. And that's what we're going to explore through an RFI. And, if I've misspoke, let me know, but that's what I've read and that's what I'm hearing being articulated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Lauren?
Well, I want to thank Liz for voicing the lack of clarity around that, because I was also confused. It seems like everyone that has spoken up is in agreement that we should give science and data the authority to move forward with the RFI. That seems like something that needs to happen in the very near future. So maybe we can definitely come to agreement on that. I do think, however, to the point that both Abby and Rich made regarding agriculture and ecosystems and the work that our subcommittee has been working on, we do have a draft set of recommendations to be incorporated into the emissions inventory from that sector. It simply hasn't been communicated well with science and data just yet, and would certainly be able to occur in the next several weeks at most, and therefore should be incorporated into the emissions inventory prior to December 1. So if we're hoping to move forward with the RFI, I'm on board. If we're hoping to move forward with the emissions inventory as is, I would say there's a very clear request from a subcommittee that we hold off on approving at least the ag sector-based emissions to make sure that our recommendations can be appropriately incorporated.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm hearing is that there is interest from one of the subcommittees to have a little bit more time to look into how they're going to handle the concerns and the recommendations they've been addressing. And so it feels a little premature to say we've resolved this and we're going to move forward in exactly how Jared put it out there. However, if folks feel like it's important to get moving on the RFI and everything, you all as a council can say, let's keep Jared, go ahead and the science and data, go ahead, keep moving with that, check in with ag and ecosystem as you're developing that, because probably that's how they can weave in their concerns, right? We could do that right now. I don't think we're in a position right now to say, go forth, because Abby's asked for some time for that subcommittee to come back with some additional thoughts around this. Okay.
I just briefly want to explicitly note that in the report that was forwarded from the Energy Futures Group on the greenhouse gas inventory review, it was noted that the existing methodology for the agriculture sector is likely not as accurate as it could or should be. And it points to the work that Dr. Galford is doing, the possibility of other models like the X-ACT model. And that, so I think that is part of the recommendations. Can a finer point be put on how we track and account for the agricultural sector emissions? Absolutely. And I think we should do that. And I would be very supportive of a recommendation that says, like, accept these recommendations and let's then have brought to the council additional recommendations specifically on the question of ag sector accounting. But I would not want all of the work that has gone into this and the unanimous agreement among the GHG task group and the science and data subcommittee on this report and on those things where we have clarity and desire to move forward to be held up if those are not the concerns, which I have not heard that they are.
Okay. Abby, go ahead, please.
Yes, just so long as I do believe, and that this is backed up by PhD researchers from UVM on our subcommittee, that there does need to be a finer point put on this. So as long as that as is in the docket and planned for, and this meeting will transpire and the recommendations will be taken up and incorporated from ag and ecosystems, I'm comfortable moving forward. If that's not the understanding of the council, I'm not comfortable moving forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. Okay, so this is one of these things where we are trying to react in real time to changes that come up, right? And so what we're going to do right now is test with you all to say, okay, you just heard Abby say something. You just saw Jared in the chat saying, I agree with you, Abby. That's what I understand this to be as well, which is we can move forward knowing that ag and ecosystem want to work with science and data and putting a finer point on this, and probably work on the RFI as well. And so we as a council say, okay, in that circumstance with that, yes, we're okay moving forward with these recommendations as Jared laid them out in the presentation. Right? So I guess my question to folks, are there other concerns that aren't being put on, we haven't discussed already around these recommendations that would prevent us from saying, yes, we actually are moving forward as the recommendations were put forward in the PowerPoint and with the caveat that Abby has laid out? Chris, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I would just suggest that for clarity's sake and for sake of the minutes and everything else, this is the kind of thing that would actually benefit from a motion. And we can handle the voting however folk want to have it. I know we're trying to work on consensus. It could be, general nodding of heads, or is there anybody opposed? But this is something that would benefit from articulated motion, exactly what we're agreeing to. So that can be captured in the minutes.
Yeah, that's great. So that's really helpful, Chris. And I think being able to actually write it down and have people see it is even better, right? So we had something written right in front of us in real time that we could look at. And I mean, let me read off what I understand to be what we're talking about right now, which is you all as a council are agreeing to move forward in the way the recommendations were presented by Jared in that PowerPoint that's attached to the agenda, with the addition of what Abby has put on the table, which is ag and ecosystem wants a space to put a finer point on those issues with science and data going forward. That's what you're agreeing to do now, if you choose to do that. Okay, so if that's the case, let me just check and see if anybody has concerns moving forward in that way. Richard?
I support the motion, so to speak, with one request, that if the conversation between ag and ecosystems and science and data would result in significant changes to the way we do the inventory, that they report back to the council.
Absolutely. I think the reporting back to the council always, and so there's no sort of judgment call about significance, I think seems like the right way to do that. Secretary Young and then Liz.
Do we have a quorum still? It's well after adjournment time. Okay, well, that would be important for a motion. And again, we have been slowly, I feel, moving from a consensus to a more formal process. So I guess I'm not surprised that we're moving so quickly to voting on something outside of the plan, but so be it if it's the will of the majority here.
Okay. Liz?
Yeah, I think your comment on reporting no matter what captures, I mean, Rich's point is where I was going when I heard about it, just like if it has some effect on the proportionality issues, or, we have this kind of sector-based approach with emissions reductions. And if there's a sector that's still not certain, especially given, those of us who haven't been deeply involved on science and data, that feels uncomfortable, but it sounds like we'll be getting that understanding one way or the other, so the significance will get judged, along with the RFI being an RFI. And so presuming that comes back to both the subcommittee and then eventually the council prior to whether an RFP moves forward, given, costs and other concerns.
Great, okay.
I would just say briefly.
Hang on 1 second, Jared. Anson, I see you're trying to jump in.
Yeah, I would just, what prevents us moving this today? I do think we have time to meet our deadlines. I'm always uncomfortable voting on something that I don't really see, and I don't know what the report of ag is actually going to have in the final report. So I don't think moving something today prevents us from meeting our deadlines moving forward. I'm always really uncomfortable with 3 or 4 steps saying it's going to do this, and then it unravels if it's not really what we're hoping to achieve. I hope I'm articulating that enough, but I always think especially if we're voting on motions, as representatives, we really need concrete proposals that are in front of us, and not sort of advancing, well, we're going to put it in, and then something may unravel, and then it's not there, and then we're stuck with this other vote, and then we go back to the beginning again. So I would prefer, like, hey, we've got time, bring it back. I'm full support. We need that ag component in there. I'm supportive of that. We need that inventory. We need that data to move forward. But I'm really uncomfortable. Like, I don't know what that's going to look like either. So I don't have enough information to make an informed decision, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, and I think
I just want to offer a point of clarification, David, if that's okay, in terms of when and how, at least I would anticipate this being really relevant. My understanding, and Secretary Moore or Colin, if he's on, can correct me, but my understanding is that there will not be, by any means, a new greenhouse gas inventory completed before the climate action plan is done. So our work right now, in terms of the initial plan we're developing by December, is based on the latest inventory numbers. In terms of what we're looking at in terms of changes to that methodology going forward, or additional supplemental analysis, that would likely bear on revisions to that plan or future climate action plans. But we are not talking about changing sectoral amounts or the methodology of the existing inventory before December 1st, by any means. And I would say I appreciate and respect what Secretary Tebbets said, and I think that there is likely benefit to, if we're going to move in this direction, having specific language around motions. I thought it was sufficient to have a specific 2-page document of recommendations circulated a week before the meeting for folks to, that's what I intended to be the concrete recommendation is, council, here is the diligence and work of our consultants of the Science and Data Subcommittee that's been looking at that. Here is our summary of recommendations that we are asking you to adopt. But if there is additional concreteness that is desired in terms of in the form of making motions, I guess that's possible if that's the direction folks want. We were sharing the result of what came out of the Science and Data Subcommittee.
Okay, Chris, last word, and then we're going to just figure out a pathway on this and set ourselves up for future meetings in a way that we don't get a little bit flummoxed like we are right now. Chris, do you want to say anything else? You're on mute, Chris.
I'll get this figured out by next pandemic. Sorry. That's what I was going to suggest. The steering committee should take up the process, because now we're getting to making decisions that are going to implement, that they're going to seriously impact the plan. And I get, and I know our whole process around consensus based, but but there were other concerns, right? It wasn't just voiced around this. It wasn't just yes, thumbs up. We are signaling a high level of support for subcommittee recommendations on GHG accounting. We're getting into something more specific. So that's what I was just saying, to really memorialize what decisions were made. I've just been involved in too many situations where, I don't know, some people think you made one decision last meeting and another group thinks you made another decision. And that's why there's benefit to memorializing it in some kind of motion and capturing that in the minutes. So you can go back and start from that point again. So it's not trying to trip things up in procedure. It's really trying to memorialize exactly what it was you decided last meeting. So you don't have to go back 6 paces, to go 3. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So on this particular issue, I think we've kind of got at the end of the road of what we can do today. And while it may be feeling frustrating and inconclusive, it sounds to me like, and listening also to the comments, that we just need to put the pause button on this and let the work play out with the Ag and Ecosystems Committee and the Science and Data Committee. Let's do that. Let that work play out. We all know we want to see that work happen. We all know that we want to see that RFI start to move forward. And yet we need to circle back and do this properly with it in front of us. So exactly. And the process should not delay the RFI. There's been a lot of support on this call. I have not heard any concerns about, slowing down the RFI, please. No, everyone said go forth, but let's put the pause button on some sort of official, yep, we're good to go on this inventory stuff until we let the Ag and Ecosystem thing play itself out. And that's not to say, Jared, that we can't say, wow, we heard a lot of support in this meeting. We're putting a pause button on some sort of more formal council sign off until we have the full thing in front of us and we're comfortably know what's happening. Okay, so let's do that in the interest of time. And I appreciate everybody on that sort of frustration of what the heck's actually going on here. And we're going to solve that so that we are able to be flexible in real time. And we will be making decisions in real time as well. Right now, we're not going to be making a good one. Lauren, and then Secretary Young, and then let's close off this piece.
And I just wanted to say Joe Flynn's been trying to be heard. That's all. I don't need to be heard.
Okay, sorry. Can I jump quick to Secretary Flynn and then Lauren will grab you?
No, I was raising my hand for Joe too.
Okay, sorry, Joe. Everybody wants to help you except me. Okay, go ahead, please.
I'm sorry, maybe it looks like I've been clapping for the last 5 minutes. I'm trying to raise my hand, but so my question has to do with process, not so much the question we're discussing.
Yeah.
We have been working on a consensus basis up until this question. And so what I'm asking is, are we now moving, or apparently we're not, based on what I just think I heard you say, David, but 5 minutes ago, I was curious, are we now moving to, we're going to actually take formal votes on everything? Because I don't think you can have it both ways. We need to start voting on the minutes. We need to start voting on issues if we're going to, or we need to remain in the collaborative consensus fashion. But I think we can't pick and choose what we're going to vote on. And that's all I wanted to say. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Secretary Flynn. I think it's back on us to make sure that we've got a really crystal clear process and everybody knows how it's going to work. And this was a great example of it not really working. So we need to take that back and be clear. And I take on board that issue of it's hard to pick and choose. Yeah. Okay, great. All right, folks. We are really not great on our agenda management today, but we've done a lot of great conversations that will make our work easier as we go forward. Jane, you've got some updates. Is there anything you have to do verbally, or can most of these be over email? Is there a way to crush these up a little bit?
I would just, most of it can be over email. I do just want to flag everyone's attention just for 2 components. One, the recognition that we'll have 3 consecutive council meetings, the 28th, October 5th, and October 12th. I recognize it's a big ask of counselors, and there'll be a lot of work in between to digest. So thank you for your time and attention to that ahead of those meetings. And then I will draw your attention that there's a slide online, an attachment to the agenda that draws your attention to the public engagement event that we will embark on next week. We've pivoted to holding them all in outdoor venue pavilions to try to be as COVID safe as possible. And those are all welcome and open to counselors. We ask that you observe them, recognizing that they're really for Vermonters to engage in the process who have typically not been able to speak and lean into the work yet. So we'll be at all of those events, and our staff, if counselors are planning to go and available to support and help in any way with respect to setup or orientation, please reach out to Marianne and I, and we'll work to find you a job. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Jane. That's great. Secretary Young?
Yeah, it looks like there is some specific action called for. on the agenda?
Approved plan for the next 3 meetings. I think, Jane, is there something we needed the council to actually say they're like, we're okay with doing the 3 meetings? Is that what we needed? Or is,
It's a funny action item on the agenda.
Yeah.
I don't have anything in mind. Thank you for
Okay, well,
bringing it up.
I just want, if I may though, for purposes of complying with the open meeting law, is this an additional meeting, Jane, or is this the regular schedule that we've noticed and posted?
The October 5th meeting is a special meeting of the Climate Council.
And that's already been posted, right? We already agreed to this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
great. Okay, so we have some space for public comment still, and thanks for everybody who's stuck in there, with council members, subcommittee members, everybody who's been with us, and members of the public. Let's take a quick check to see if we have members of the public who would like to offer some comment on all these issues we've been wrestling with today as a council. If you'd like to, please go ahead and raise your hand as a Zoom function, and let's see how many folks we have today to get a sense of our timing. I'm seeing one hand. Are there any other folks that would like to make a comment today, just to help us understand? If you're on the phone with us today, I don't see actually anybody on the phone. One person, you can do *9 to raise your hand. Okay, I'm seeing 2 hands, so let's just take a couple minutes each. The first person is initials GMG. You'll have to introduce yourself, please, when you speak. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm George Gross. GMG is just an artifact of the workstation I'm on. I did have a little bit of disappointment about today's outcome with respect to the greenhouse gas accounting and supplemental information recommendations. Having been an active participant in the process throughout the last 6 months or so that it's been in progress, it was fairly mature and ready for, I think, moving forward as written. It is true also that the ag and ecosystems work is been done largely in parallel and to some extent is orthogonal until you actually decide to do a merge of the 2 activities, but that would not be a barrier to actually taking what was, I thought, a reasonably well-produced process and well vetted as moving it to the finish line today, whether it took a motion or consensus, irrespective of procedural issues. It should have moved forward and not been impeded today. With regards to the future work, obviously the ag and ecosystems work has not been as actively discussed in science data, and it would be unfortunate that it would become a long-term source of confusion, because it took quite a few months of research by the Energy Futures Group to put together the report and the inventory statements that they did. I would hope perhaps you haven't set a deadline. That would be a reasonable thing to do to bring this topic to closure. And one final comment. As part of the work that they did over the last 6 months, Science Data also came up with societal cost of a metric ton of carbon dioxide. I think that is a factor that should be used a much more active role than it is currently to determine the cost effectiveness and relevance of any given particular policy. I think it might actually change some of the outcomes you might otherwise have taken. Thank you.
Thank you, George, very much. Appreciate you sticking with us today. Annette, you've got your hand up. Go ahead, please.
I posted my question in the chat. I'd just like you to please reintroduce Bram Kleppner and what his role is, because I came in late. Thank you.
Sure. Bram is a member of the Climate Council, replacing Adam Knudsen.
And what seat was that?
I think it's called manufacturers. Bram, what's the exact seat? Manufacturing or?
Yes, manufacturers.
Thank you.
Okay, super. Okay, any other comments from members of the public today? Okay, great. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in there. We apologize that we went 45 minutes later or 35, 40 minutes later than we said we would. We did a lot of good work today. Any next steps that we haven't said already? I'll ask Jane or Secretary Young if there's anything else that's come up today.
No, I think that last discussion is one step that is going to occur at the committee level. And just looking at the drafting deadline, it looks like we all should expect something around the 21st for review and comments and for a focused discussion on gaps, red flags, and questions at the next VCC meeting. So focus, I think, will be great. And, you know, there are recommendations as to how we focus that conversation at the next steering committee meeting. You know, maybe we could help with that.
Thanks. Wonderful. Okay, guys, I think we're done. Take care, everybody, and we'll be seeing you soon. And really appreciate all the thoughtful work that happened today. I thought we really made progress on a number of key issues. Take care, everybody. Have a good rest of your afternoon.
Everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.